The night the outlaws came, Celine Mercer stood alone on the rooftop, with a rifle in her trembling hands and nothing but firelight between her family and death. 5 armed men circled the trading fort through the snow, expecting frightened women and easy plunder. They found a warrior instead. But this wasn't how her story began. To understand the woman who refused to run when the frontier burned, you need to know about the daughter nobody saw, the one they called useful, never beautiful, the one who kept everyone alive while they praised someone else. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The Montana Territory. Winter of 1878 arrived like a predator, silent, patient, and absolutely merciless. Celine Mercer stood in the frozen courtyard of her family's trading fort at 4:30 in the morning, her breath forming white clouds in the darkness, her hands already numb despite the thick work gloves she wore. The thermometer nailed to the supply shed read 9 degrees below zero. She didn't need to check it. After 23 years in this unforgiving country, she could feel the cold's intentions in her bones. Around her, the fort remained dark and silent. Her mother wouldn't wake for another 3 hours. Her younger sister Charlotte wouldn't emerge from her warm bedroom until the sun had fully risen and someone else had already stoked the fires, boiled the water, and prepared breakfast. Their father had been dead for 4 years, and in his absence, the weight of keeping the Mercer trading post alive had fallen entirely on Celine's shoulders. Not that anyone acknowledged it. She moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the efficiency of long practice, her tall frame casting strange shadows in the lamplight. At 5'9" and broad-shouldered from years of physical labor, Celine had long ago abandoned any pretense of delicate femininity. Her hands were calloused and rope-scarred. Her face was weathered from sun and wind. Her dark hair, more practical than pretty, was pulled back in a severe braid that hung between her shoulder blades. The useful daughter, the townspeople called her. Never beautiful, never graceful, just useful. The first task was always the livestock. Celine hauled water from the well, the rope rough even through her gloves, and broke the ice that had formed overnight in the troughs. The horses stamped and snorted in their stalls, grateful for her presence. She fed them, checked their legs for injury, and whispered quiet words that no human ever heard. By the time gray light began to crack the eastern horizon, she had inventoried the warehouse, discovered that 3 supply crates had been damaged by moisture, reorganized the entire storage system to prevent future losses, and identified a discrepancy in the previous month's freight invoices that suggested someone, probably the Carter Freight Company, was systematically overcharging them. She made a note to investigate. Then another note to confront the freight manager. Then a third note reminding herself that her mother would tell her to let the men handle business matters, and she would have to do it anyway, alone, while pretending she hadn't. The Mercer trading post sat at a critical junction where 3 valleys converged in the western Montana mountains. In the glory days before the financial panic of 1873, her father had built it into one of the most prosperous supply stations in the territory, a place where ranchers, miners, trappers, and settlers could find everything from flour and ammunition to farm equipment and fabric. But those glory days were gone. Her father's death had revealed the truth hidden beneath years of prosperous appearances. The business was drowning in debt. Predatory lenders had been circling for years, offering easy credit with devastating terms. Corrupt suppliers had been inflating invoices and delivering short shipments. The financial panic had destroyed trade routes and collapsed commodity prices. Celine had discovered all of this while sorting through her father's papers the week after his funeral. Her mother had been too grief-stricken to face the documents. Charlotte had been too delicate. So Celine had sat alone in the office for 3 days straight, piecing together the financial catastrophe her father had hidden from everyone. The fort was 6 months from foreclosure. That had been 4 years ago. 4 years of Celine working 18-hour days, renegotiating contracts, cutting costs to the bone, and somehow, impossibly, keeping the business alive through sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. 4 years of her mother pretending everything was fine while quietly selling off family heirlooms. 4 years of Charlotte being paraded at every social gathering as the family's last hope for a prosperous marriage alliance. 4 years of Celine being invisible. Celine! Her mother's voice cut through the morning air like a knife through butter. Celine, where are you? The breakfast fire isn't lit. Celine closed her eyes and counted to 5. She had already lit the breakfast fire, an hour ago. It was burning cheerfully in the kitchen stove right now, which her mother would have known if she'd bothered to check before shouting. "Coming, Mother," she called back. She found Constance Mercer standing in the kitchen doorway, wearing an elaborate silk morning robe that had cost more than most families earned in a month, one of the few luxuries the woman refused to sacrifice despite their financial situation. At 47, Constance was still beautiful in the way that some women managed to be even when life had been cruel to them. Her blonde hair was perfectly arranged. Her face was carefully composed. Her entire existence was a performance of gentility that refused to acknowledge the crumbling reality around her. "The fire is already burning, Mother," Celine said quietly, gesturing toward the stove. Constance glanced at it with mild surprise, then immediately shifted to her next complaint. "Well, Charlotte's room is freezing. She's too delicate for this cold. You know how easily she catches ill." Celine bit back the response that wanted to escape. Charlotte was 20 years old and perfectly healthy. The reason her room was cold was because she refused to wake early enough to add wood to her own stove, preferring instead to sleep late and then complain when the fire had died. But saying this would only trigger one of her mother's lectures about sisterly devotion and family loyalty. "I'll take care of it," Celine said instead. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, carrying an armload of split wood. Charlotte's room was at the end of the hall, the largest bedroom with windows facing east to catch the morning sun. Their father had given it to her when she turned 16, saying his beautiful youngest daughter deserved beautiful surroundings. Celine's room was a converted storage closet beside the kitchen. She knocked softly. No answer. She knocked again, then carefully opened the door. Charlotte was still asleep. Her golden hair spread across the pillow like something from a painting, her delicate features peaceful in the gray morning light. She looked like their mother had at that age, petite, blonde, lovely in a way that made men stumble over their own feet, and women unconsciously touch their own faces in comparison. Celine moved quietly to the stove, cleaned out the dead ashes, and rebuilt the fire with quick, practiced movements. Within minutes, warmth began to spread through the room. Charlotte stirred slightly but didn't wake. For just a moment, Celine stood there looking at her sister. She didn't feel jealous, not exactly. Jealousy would require believing that beauty and ease were things she deserved. Instead, she felt something more complicated, a tired acceptance that some people were born to be admired while others were born to keep the fires burning. "You're staring." Celine jumped slightly. Charlotte's blue eyes were open now, watching her with an expression that might have been amusement or pity or both. "Just making sure the fire caught," Celine said quickly. "Mother said you were cold." "Mother says a lot of things." Charlotte sat up slowly, pulling the quilts around her shoulders. "You don't have to wait on me like a servant, you know. I can rebuild my own fire." "Can you?" The words came out sharper than Celine intended. Charlotte flinched as if struck, and immediately Celine regretted it. Her sister wasn't cruel, not deliberately. She was simply oblivious to everything that happened outside her own immediate needs, the way someone raised as the center of attention often was. "I'm sorry," Celine said. "That was unkind." "No." Charlotte's voice was quiet. "It was true." She looked down at her hands, soft, uncalloused, decorative hands. "I don't actually know how to do most things, do I? You've always just done them." The moment hung between them, strange and uncomfortable. Then Constance's voice echoed up the stairs, shattering it. "Celine, the Carter boy is here with the morning freight, and he's asking about payment again." The fragile connection broke. Charlotte looked away. Celine turned toward the door. "I know," Charlotte said softly. "You always should." Samuel Carter stood in the courtyard with the confidence of a young man who knew his family controlled the only major freight company within 100 miles. At 25, he had his father's sharp features and none of his business sense, a dangerous combination that had led to increasingly aggressive collection tactics over the past year. "Miss Mercer." He touched his hat in a gesture that managed to be both polite and condescending. "I'm here about the outstanding balance." Celine kept her expression neutral. "The balance that includes 3 months of overcharges for routes your company never actually ran?" Samuel's smile tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Then perhaps you should review your invoices more carefully." Celine pulled a folded paper from her apron pocket and handed it to him. "I've documented every discrepancy." Your company has been charging us for express delivery on shipments that arrived weeks late, billing us for secure transport on goods that arrived damaged, and most interestingly, invoicing us for freight weight that exceeds the physical capacity of your wagons. She watched him scan the paper, his face reddening with each line. She'd spent 3 nights cross-referencing their invoices against shipping manifests, freight schedules, and the actual physical evidence of deliveries. The proof was irrefutable. Samuel struggled for words. These are serious accusations. They're documented facts, Celine corrected. And unless your father would like me to present this evidence to the Territorial Commerce Board, I suggest the Carter Freight Company recalculates our balance to reflect actual services rendered. For a long moment, Samuel stared at her with undisguised hatred. Women, especially frontier women who worked with their hands and spoke their minds, weren't supposed to challenge men in business. They certainly weren't supposed to have evidence. My father won't like this, he said finally. Your father has been systematically defrauding every small business in this valley, Celine replied calmly. I imagine there's quite a lot he won't like once people start comparing notes. Samuel's jaw clenched. You're making a mistake. I'm correcting one. He climbed back onto his freight wagon without another word, snapping the reins harder than necessary. Celine watched him disappear down the valley road, her heart pounding despite her calm exterior. She'd just declared war on one of the most powerful families in the territory. She'd had no choice. Behind her, she heard her mother's horrified gasp. Constance had been watching from the doorway. What have you done? Constance's voice shook. Samuel Carter? You challenge Samuel Carter? His father controls half the freight routes in Montana Territory. His father has been stealing from us for years, Celine said wearily. Someone had to stop it. Someone? Constance's voice rose. You mean some man should have handled it? Your father should have handled it? Or we should have found a man to marry Charlotte who could handle it? But you? She laughed bitterly. You've just destroyed our last chance at survival. No one will do business with a woman who makes enemies of powerful men. Celine turned to face her mother. We're already destroyed, Mother. We've been dying slowly for 4 years. At least this way we die fighting. Don't be dramatic. I'm being realistic. Celine's voice was flat with exhaustion. The freight company has been bleeding us dry. The bank is 3 months from foreclosing, and every supplier in the territory knows we're desperate, which means they're raising prices and demanding cash payment we don't have. She met her mother's eyes. The only question is whether we surrender quietly or make them work for it. Constance looked at her eldest daughter as if seeing a stranger. When did you become so hard? The day I realized no one was coming to save us. The words hung in the cold morning air. Then Constance turned and walked back into the house, her silk robe trailing behind her like a flag of defeated gentility. The storm arrived 3 days later. Celine saw it coming from miles away, a wall of dark clouds rolling over the mountains like an invading army. She'd lived through enough Montana winters to recognize the signature of a genuine killer storm, the particular quality of the light, the way the wind shifted directions, the absolute stillness that fell over the valley just before the sky opened up. Everyone inside, she shouted across the courtyard. Secure the livestock. Bring in all the firewood you can carry. The few customers browsing the trading post scattered to their wagons, racing to make it home before the storm hit. Celine worked frantically to reinforce the barn doors, double-check the warehouse seals, and bring in enough supplies to survive several days of being snowed in. She was hauling the last load of firewood when she saw the rider. He emerged from the tree line at the valley's edge like an apparition, a single horseman pushing through the gathering wind, leaning forward over his horse's neck as snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes. Even from a distance, Celine could tell he was in trouble. The horse was limping. The rider's posture suggested injury or exhaustion or both. Common sense said to let him find shelter elsewhere. The storm was going to be catastrophic. They had their own survival to worry about. Celine ran toward him anyway. Here, she shouted over the rising wind. This way! The rider's head came up. He changed direction, guiding his struggling horse toward the fort. As he drew closer, Celine got her first clear look at him. He was tall, several inches taller than her, with broad shoulders and the lean, hard build of someone who'd spent their life doing physical labor. His face was weathered, his jaw dark with several days of beard growth. his eyes an unusual shade of gray that seemed to reflect the storm clouds above. He looked to be in his early 30s, and there was something about the way he sat his horse, despite obvious exhaustion, that suggested competence and control. "Barnes this way!" Celine gestured urgently. "Storm's going to hit hard!" He nodded, too tired for words. She helped him dismount. He was heavier than he looked, all muscle and bone, and together they got his limping horse into a stall. The animal was a beautiful buckskin gelding, well-bred and well cared for despite the hard journey. "Thrown shoe," the stranger said, his voice rough with cold and fatigue. 2 miles back. Tried to make it to Fort Benton, but the storm came early," Celine finished. She was already examining the horse's hoof. "You're lucky you found us. Next shelter is 15 miles north, and you wouldn't have made it." She worked quickly, her hands moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd treated countless injured animals. The stranger watched her in silence, swaying slightly on his feet. When she finished bandaging the horse's leg, she turned to find him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You know horses," he said. "I know survival," she corrected. "Out here, they're the same thing." Thunder cracked overhead, strange for a winter storm, but not impossible in the mountains. The first real wave of snow hit like a physical force, and Celine grabbed the stranger's arm. "Inside, now!" They ran through the sudden whiteout, Celine leading the way by memory, since visibility had dropped to almost nothing. She shoved open the kitchen door and pulled him through just as the full fury of the storm hit. Inside, Constance and Charlotte stood frozen in shock, staring at the snow-covered stranger who'd just stumbled into their kitchen like something from a Gothic novel. "Celine!" Constance gasped. "What is the meaning of this?" "Meaning?" Celine was already moving toward the stove, grabbing blankets from the storage chest. "The meaning is that a man was about to freeze to death in a blizzard, and we're not barbarians." She thrust the blankets at the stranger. "Sit by the fire. Get warm. Charlotte, make coffee. Mother, we're going to need extra blankets in the guest room." But her mother and sister weren't moving. They were both staring at the stranger with wide eyes, and Celine suddenly realized why. Even exhausted, half frozen, and covered in snow, the man was striking. Not handsome in the conventional sense. His features were too rough for that, his face too weathered. But there was something compelling about him. Something that commanded attention the way a lightning storm commanded attention. "Ladies," he removed his snow-covered hat, and his voice carried the cultured accent of someone educated back east. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. My name is Riker Vale. I'm a cattle rancher from the Judith Basin, and I appear to be at your mercy." Constance's entire demeanor transformed in an instant. The irritated mother became the gracious hostess, all smiles and hospitality. "Mr. Vale, of course you're welcome here. Charlotte, dear, don't just stand there. Help the gentleman with his coat. Celine, prepare the guest room immediately." Celine watched her mother's performance with tired familiarity. She'd seen this before, the way Constance shifted into matchmaking mode whenever any remotely eligible man appeared within Charlotte's orbit. It didn't matter that this particular man had just survived a near-death experience in a blizzard. What mattered was that he was male, apparently prosperous, and unmarried. "The guest room's already prepared, Mother," Celine said quietly. "I'll show Mr. Vale upstairs." But Constance was already guiding him toward the parlor, chattering about the unexpected pleasure of company during a storm, while Charlotte followed behind like a beautiful shadow, suddenly shy and delicate in a way that made men feel protective. Celine carried his saddlebags upstairs alone. Pastel. The storm raged for 3 days. Outside, the world disappeared beneath layers of snow and ice. Inside, the Mercer household settled into a strange routine shaped by their unexpected guest's presence. Riker Vale was unlike any man Celine had encountered in the Montana territory. He was educated, genuinely educated, not just frontier literate. He'd attended university in Boston, studied animal husbandry and business management, and returned west to build one of the most successful cattle operations in the region. He spoke multiple languages. He'd read books that even Celine had only heard of, and he treated everyone in the household with the same courteous respect, from Constance to Charlotte to Celine herself, which made it all the more painful to watch her mother's orchestrated campaign to throw Charlotte at him. Constance arranged for Charlotte to serve Riker his meals, to sit beside him in the parlor, to happen to be reading poetry when he entered a room. She engineered countless accidental encounters and made sure Charlotte wore her finest dresses despite the fact that they were snowed in at a frontier trading post. Charlotte played her assigned role perfectly, blushing on cue, laughing at his stories, asking breathless questions about his ranch and his travels. She was everything a frontier gentleman could want: beautiful, refined, delicate, and properly feminine. And Riker was unfailingly polite to her. But Celine noticed something her mother missed. His attention kept drifting. On the second day of the storm, Celine was in the barn checking on the livestock when Riker appeared in the doorway. "May I help?" he asked. She looked up in surprise. Most men of his status wouldn't offer to do manual labor, especially not work they considered beneath them. "You don't have to." "I know," he said simply, "but I don't like being useless." So they worked together in comfortable silence, feeding animals and checking water supplies. Celine was acutely aware of him beside her, the economical way he moved, the competence in his hands, the fact that he didn't try to take over or offer unwanted advice. He simply worked as an equal partner. "Your mother mentioned your father passed away," Riker said eventually. "4 years ago?" "Yes." Celine didn't elaborate. She'd learned that most people didn't really want to hear about her father's death or the financial disaster he'd left behind. "That must have been difficult, taking over a business operation like this." Celine almost laughed. "I didn't take over. I just kept things from completely falling apart." "There's a difference." "Is there?" Riker's gray eyes studied her thoughtfully. "Seems to me that keeping things from falling apart is the hardest job there is." Something in his tone made her look up. He wasn't being condescending or dismissive. He sounded like he actually understood. "The freight company is systematically overcharging you," he said suddenly. "Aren't they?" Celine's hands stilled on the hay bale she was lifting. "How did you—" "I saw the invoice on your desk, and I've dealt with the Carters before." His expression darkened. "They're sharks. They target struggling businesses and bleed them dry through fraudulent charges and monopolistic pricing." "I confronted them," Celine admitted, 3 days before you arrived. Presented documented evidence of their fraud." Riker's eyebrows rose. "Documented evidence. Cross-referenced invoices, shipping manifests, and delivery records going back 18 months. She couldn't keep a note of pride from her voice. "They've been stealing from us for years." For a long moment, Riker just looked at her. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not the polite social smile he used with her mother and sister, but something genuine and approving. "That took courage," he said quietly, "and intelligence. Most people wouldn't have caught the discrepancies, much less compiled proof." Celine felt heat rise in her cheeks and immediately hated herself for it. She was 23 years old, too old and too practical to blush like a schoolgirl at a simple compliment. "It was necessary," she said brusquely, turning back to her work. "Someone had to do it." "But you're the one who did." The way he said it, like it mattered, like she mattered, made something crack open in Celine's chest, a feeling she couldn't name and didn't want to examine. They finished the barn work in silence. As they walked back to the house through the snow, Riker spoke again. "Your mother seems intent on matchmaking." The blunt observation caught Celine off guard. She glanced at him, trying to gauge whether he was offended or amused. "She means well. Charlotte needs someone to take care of her. And Mother thinks a prosperous marriage is our only path to security." "And what do you think?" No one had ever asked her that. Not about Charlotte's future, not about the business, not about anything that mattered. "I think," Celine said slowly, "that security built on someone else's goodwill is just a different kind of cage." Riker stopped walking. Snow fell around them in thick, lazy flakes, and his gray eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're not like anyone I've ever met," he said. Celine laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I'm exactly like every other overlooked frontier woman who works too hard and has nothing to show for it." "No." His voice was quiet but certain. "You're not." Before she could respond, the kitchen door flew open and Charlotte appeared, backlit by warm lamplight, looking like an angel in the snow. "There you are," she called to Riker, her voice musical with relief. "Mother was worried you'd gotten lost in the storm. Come inside before you freeze." The moment shattered. Riker smiled politely and started toward the house. Celine followed more slowly, watching him go. trying to ignore the strange ache in her chest. That night, she lay awake in her small converted closet bedroom and listened to the storm howl outside. Through the thin walls, she could hear her mother and Charlotte talking in excited whispers about Riker Vale, his prospects, his ranch, his obvious quality. Not once did they mention his intelligence, his genuine kindness, the way he treated people as equals rather than inferiors. They saw him as a prize to be won. Celine saw him as someone who might understand what it meant to build something worth keeping, and that, she knew, was the most dangerous thing she could possibly feel. On the third morning, the storm finally broke. Celine woke before dawn to find the world transformed. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the valley, and the sky had cleared to a brilliant, painful blue. The temperature had dropped even further, cold enough that the air itself seemed to crystallize. She dressed quickly and headed outside to begin digging out. The barn needed to be accessible, the courtyard needed to be cleared, and the warehouse roof needed to be checked for structural damage from the weight of snow. She'd been working for less than an hour when Riker appeared beside her, already dressed for heavy labor. "Where do you need me?" he asked. They worked together as the sun rose, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Riker proved to be exactly what he appeared, a man who understood hard work and didn't shy from it. He matched her pace, anticipated what needed to be done, and never once suggested that she should go inside and let him handle things. They were clearing the warehouse roof when Constance emerged from the house, her face a mask of horror. "Celine, get down from there immediately. That's dangerous work. Mr. Vale, please, you shouldn't be doing manual labor. You're a guest." Riker paused, shovel in hand, and looked down at Constance with polite confusion. "Ma'am, your daughter and I are preventing your warehouse from collapsing under snow load. I'm not sure what about that situation suggests I should be sitting comfortably inside while she risks her life alone." Constance's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The concept of a gentleman voluntarily choosing to work alongside a woman, choosing to see that work as worthy rather than beneath him, seemed to short-circuit her entire worldview. "But Charlotte could bring you hot coffee," she tried weakly. "I'll have coffee when the work is done," Riker said firmly. Then he turned back to Celine. "Which section should we clear next?" Celine felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Hope. They finished the roof work and moved on to clearing paths through the courtyard. Constance retreated inside, defeated and confused. Charlotte appeared at the window several times, watching them with an expression Celine couldn't quite read. "Your family doesn't know what to make of you," Riker observed as they paused for water. "My family doesn't know what to make of any woman who isn't decorative," Celine corrected. "I'm the useful one. Charlotte's the beautiful one. Those are our roles." "Those are the roles assigned to you," Riker said. "They're not who you are." Celine's hands tightened on her shovel. "You don't know anything about who I am, don't I?" He met her eyes steadily. "I know you're smart enough to catch systematic fraud that everyone else missed, strong enough to do work that breaks most men, brave enough to confront powerful people when it would be safer to stay quiet, and selfless enough to keep your entire family alive while they barely notice you exist." He paused. "Did I miss anything?" Celine couldn't speak. No one had ever seen her this clearly. No one had ever bothered to look. "Mr. Vale." "Riker," he corrected gently. "Please." Riker. His name felt strange on her tongue. "Why are you here? Really? A cattle rancher from the Judith Basin doesn't just happen to be traveling through this valley in the middle of winter." For the first time since his arrival, he looked uncomfortable. "I was investigating business opportunities, potential partnerships with trading posts and supply stations." "Investigating us, you mean?" "Yes." He didn't try to deny it. "The Mercer Trading Post has a reputation for fair dealing and quality goods. I wanted to see if that reputation was deserved. And I found something more interesting than a business partnership." His gray eyes held hers. "I found you." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Celine's heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Then Charlotte's voice called from the doorway, "Celine, Mother needs you inside. Something about the storeroom inventory?" The spell broke. Celine stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they'd been standing. "I should go," Riker said quietly. But Celine, this conversation isn't finished. She fled toward the house, her thoughts in chaos, and didn't see the way he watched her go. Like a man who'd just found something he hadn't known he'd been searching for. Inside, Constance was waiting with an expression of barely controlled fury. "What?" she hissed. "Do you think you're doing?" Celine blinked. "Clearing snow from the— I mean, with Mr. Vale." Constance's voice shook. "That man is our last chance, Celine. Our last chance. And you're out there doing manual labor beside him like a common farmhand, making him think we're some kind of desperate, uncivilized— We are desperate, Mother." "Don't interrupt me." Constance's hands trembled. "Charlotte is this family's future. Charlotte is beautiful and refined and everything a man like Riker Vale could want in a wife. But how is she supposed to catch his attention when you're constantly inserting yourself into situations where you don't belong?" The words landed like physical blows. Celine had heard variations of this her entire life, but somehow, today, they hurt more than usual. "I'm not trying to catch anyone's attention," she said quietly. "I'm trying to keep us alive. You're trying to compete with your own sister." "I'm not— Charlotte!" Constance called toward the parlor. "Come here, please." Charlotte appeared and Celine's heart sank. Her sister's eyes were red-rimmed, her beautiful face blotchy from crying. "Tell Celine what you told me," Constance commanded. Charlotte looked at the floor. I saw the way he looks at you." The words were barely a whisper. Celine felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "Charlotte, he's supposed to look at me," Charlotte's voice broke. "Men always look at me. That's what I'm for. That's the only thing I'm for." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'm not smart like you. I'm not capable like you. I'm just pretty. And if I can't even keep a man's attention with that, then what good am I?" The raw pain in her sister's voice cut through Celine's own hurt. She'd never realized that Charlotte's cage might be as confining as her own, just gilded differently. "You're more than just pretty," Celine said softly. "No, I'm not." Charlotte wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "You've made sure of that. You do everything. You fix everything. You're so competent and strong and useful that there's nothing left for me to be except decorative." She looked up, and her blue eyes were full of resentment and despair. "I hate you for it sometimes. And I hate myself for hating you." The silence that followed was deafening. Constance moved to put her arm around Charlotte, shooting Celine a look of pure accusation. "This is what your selfishness has done. Your own sister is crying because you can't bear to let her have one thing that could save this family." Celine felt something inside her go very still and very cold. "If you want Riker Vale to marry Charlotte," she said quietly, "then by all means make it happen. I'll stay out of your way." She turned and walked out of the room before either of them could see her face crack. That night, Constance orchestrated the most elaborate dinner their struggling household could manage. She brought out the last of their fine china, the good silverware they hadn't sold, the preserved delicacies they'd been hoarding for emergencies. Charlotte wore her finest dress, blue silk that matched her eyes, and her hair was arranged in elaborate curls. Celine wore her usual plain work dress and kept her hair in its practical braid. Throughout the meal, Constance directed conversation toward Riker and Charlotte, asking leading questions about his ranch, his prospects, his views on marriage and family. Charlotte played her role beautifully, batting her eyelashes and blushing in all the right places. Riker was polite, attentive, completely proper, and his eyes kept finding Celine. She tried not to notice, tried not to feel the weight of his gaze, tried to focus on her food and ignore the increasingly desperate edge to her mother's matchmaking attempts. "Charlotte plays piano beautifully," Constance announced. "Perhaps after dinner she could perform for us." "I'd be delighted to hear her play," Riker said courteously. "Then, does Celine play as well?" The question caught everyone off guard. Constance laughed, a brittle, dismissive sound. "Celine, no. We tried to teach her when she was young, but she didn't have the patience for it. She's much more suited to practical pursuits." "Practical pursuits," Riker repeated slowly, "like running a trading post, managing accounts, negotiating with freight companies, keeping an entire family alive through impossible circumstances." Constance's smile froze. "Well, yes, Celine has been helpful with those matters." "Helpful," Riker set down his fork with deliberate care. Mrs. Mercer, I've been in business for 12 years. I've built one of the largest cattle operations in Montana Territory, and I can recognize management genius when I see it. He looked directly at Celine. Your daughter isn't helpful. She's extraordinary. The silence that fell over the table was absolute. Celine couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. Charlotte made a small, wounded sound and stood abruptly. "Excuse me," she whispered, and fled from the room. Constance's face had gone white with fury. "Mr. Vale, I believe you've misunderstood." "I haven't misunderstood anything," Riker said quietly. "I've spent 3 days in this house. I've watched how it operates. I've seen who actually runs things and who takes credit." He stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Mercer, but I think it's time I was honest about why I'm here." He turned to face Celine, and his gray eyes were blazing with something she'd never seen directed at her before. Absolute certainty. "Celine Mercer," he said, "I came to this valley looking for a business partnership, but I found something infinitely more valuable." He took a breath. "I found a woman strong enough to be a true partner, someone who understands what it means to build something worth keeping, someone who sees problems and solves them instead of waiting to be rescued." "Mr. Vale," Constance tried to interrupt. "I'm not finished," Riker's voice cut through her protest like a blade. "I don't want a decorative wife to hang on my arm at social gatherings. I don't want someone delicate who needs to be protected from reality. I want an equal, a partner, someone brave enough and brilliant enough to build an empire beside me." He held out his hand toward Celine. "I want you." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Celine stared at his outstretched hand like it was a snake that might bite her. "You don't know me," she whispered. "I know enough. You've been here 3 days. I've learned more about you in 3 days than most people learn about each other in 3 years." His hand didn't waver. "I see you, Celine, all of you, the strength and the brilliance and the bone-deep courage. And I'm asking you to consider the possibility that you deserve to be seen." Constance had risen from her seat, her face twisted with rage and desperation. "This is insanity. She's not. Charlotte is the one who..." "Charlotte is a lovely young woman who deserves to marry someone who wants her for who she is," Riker said without taking his eyes off Celine. "Not someone her mother trapped into an arrangement." He paused. "But I'm not that someone. I never was." Celine's hands were shaking. Her entire life, she'd been told she was worth less than her sister. Less beautiful. Less desirable. Less everything that mattered. And now this man, this extraordinary, impossible man, was standing in her mother's dining room saying the opposite. It felt like a dream, or a trick, or a cruel joke the universe was playing. "I don't understand," she said helplessly. "Why?" "Because," Riker said simply, "I've been searching my entire adult life for someone who sees the world the way I do. Someone who understands that real strength isn't about domination, it's about partnership. Someone who knows that the most valuable things are the ones you build together." His voice softened. "I've been looking for you. I just didn't know it until I found you." Behind him, Constance was making choking sounds of protest. Somewhere upstairs, Charlotte was probably crying. The rational part of Celine's brain was screaming that this was madness, that you couldn't fall in love in 3 days, that she was risking everything on a stranger's words, that she should be practical and careful and safe. But the rest of her, the part that had been invisible for so long, was reaching toward his hand like a flower reaching toward the sun. "If I say yes," she whispered, "everything changes." "Everything's already changed," Riker said. "The only question is whether you're brave enough to admit it." Celine looked at his outstretched hand, then at her mother's horrified face, then at the empty doorway through which Charlotte had fled. Her entire life had been about sacrifice, about being useful, about keeping other people alive at the cost of her own happiness. For once, just once, she wanted to choose herself. She took his hand. The warmth of Riker's hand around hers felt like the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned liquid and uncertain. Celine stood there in her mother's dining room, acutely aware of the magnitude of what she'd just done, and equally aware that there was no taking it back. Constance's voice shattered the moment like glass against stone. "Get out!" The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of absolute fury. Celine turned to find her mother standing rigid beside the table, her face pale, except for two bright spots of color on her cheeks. "Mother, I said get out." Constance's hands trembled at her sides. "You've destroyed everything. Everything I've worked for, everything I've sacrificed, everything I've tried to build for this family. And for what? For some fantasy that a man like him could actually want someone like you?" The words hit like physical blows, but before Celine could respond, Riker stepped between them. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, and his voice had gone cold as the Montana winter outside. "You will not speak to her that way. This is my house, and she is the only reason you still have it." Riker's words cut through the room with surgical precision. "I've reviewed your financial records. Yes, I looked, because I wanted to understand what I was walking into. Your trading post should have collapsed 2 years ago. The only reason it hasn't is because your daughter has been performing miracles with nothing but determination and intelligence." Constance's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "You've been selling off family heirlooms to maintain appearances," Riker continued relentlessly. "Buying expensive dresses for Charlotte while the warehouse roof leaks. Hosting elaborate dinners you can't afford while Celine wears the same 3 work dresses she's owned for 5 years. He paused, and his voice dropped to something quiet and dangerous. "You've been sacrificing the wrong daughter. How dare you? How dare I tell the truth?" Riker's gray eyes blazed. "How dare I recognize value when your own blindness has kept you from seeing it? Your daughter is brilliant. She's capable of things that would make most men weep with inadequacy. And you've spent her entire life telling her she's nothing but useful." Constance swayed slightly, gripping the back of a chair for support. For a moment, Celine almost felt sorry for her. Seeing the careful construction of her mother's world crumble in real time was painful to witness. Then Constance's face hardened into something cruel. "Fine," she said flatly. "Take her. Marry the workhorse if that's what you want. But don't come crying to me when you realize what you've lost." She looked past Riker to Celine, and her eyes were cold as January ice. "You'll be back. When he realizes what he's actually gotten, a woman with rough hands and a rougher tongue, someone who can't even pretend to be gentle, you'll be back. And I won't let you in." The threat hung in the air. Celine felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, but rather settling into place. The last fragile hope that her mother might someday see her, value her, love her for who she actually was. That hope died quietly in the space between heartbeats. "I know," Celine said softly. "I've always known." She turned toward the door, Riker's hand still warm around hers. Behind them, Constance made a sound that might have been a sob or might have been rage. Celine didn't look back. Upstairs, a door slammed so hard the walls shook. Charlotte's grief echoed through the house like a ghost. They walked through the kitchen and out into the cold night air. Snow crunched beneath their feet, and the stars overhead blazed with an intensity only possible in the deep winter dark. Celine's breath came in short, sharp gasps that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the fact that her entire life had just been torn apart and rebuilt in the space of 20 minutes. "I need to check the barn," she said abruptly, pulling her hand free from his. "The horses need Celine, and the water troughs might have frozen again, and—" "Celine," Riker caught her shoulders gently, turning her to face him. "Breathe." She tried, failed, tried again. Her whole body was shaking, and she couldn't tell if it was from cold or shock or the delayed realization of what she'd just done. "I just destroyed my family," she whispered. "No." Riker's voice was firm. "You just chose yourself. There's a difference." "Is there?" Celine looked up at him and felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes. Angry tears, terrified tears, tears she'd been holding back for so long they felt like acid. "My sister is upstairs crying because I took something she thought was hers. My mother just disowned me, and you—" Her voice cracked. "You don't actually know me. You've been here 3 days. 3 days. What if you wake up tomorrow and realize you made a terrible mistake? Then I'll deal with it tomorrow," Riker said calmly. "But I won't, because I'm very good at recognizing what I want, and I've never been more certain of anything in my life." "How can you be certain?" "Because I've spent 12 years building a business empire, and I've never once found anyone who understood what that actually meant until I met you." His hands tightened slightly on her shoulders. "Most people see success and assume it's easy. They don't see the 18-hour days, the impossible decisions, the constant weight of knowing that dozens of people depend on you getting it right. But you know, you live it every single day. Celine closed her eyes. I'm scared. Good, Riker said. So am I. That means we're both smart enough to understand what we're risking. A sound from the house made them both turn. Charlotte stood in the kitchen doorway, wrapped in a shawl, her face blotchy from crying, but her expression strangely composed. I need to talk to Celine, she said quietly. Alone. Riker looked at Celine, a question in his eyes. She nodded, and he stepped back, moving toward the barn to give them privacy. The two sisters stood facing each other in the snow, separated by 3 feet of space and a lifetime of unspoken resentments. I hate you, Charlotte said conversationally. Celine flinched. I know. But I also don't. Charlotte wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Because you're right. About everything, I am useless. I don't know how to do anything except look pretty and be agreeable and wait for someone to save me. Charlotte! Let me finish. Charlotte's voice shook slightly. When I saw the way he looked at you tonight, I wanted to claw your eyes out. I wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that this was supposed to be my moment, my chance, my future. She paused. But then I realized something. I was angry at you for taking what I wanted, but I never once asked myself if I actually wanted him. Celine blinked. What? Riker Vale is handsome and rich and educated, Charlotte said slowly. He's everything Mother taught me to want in a husband, but he's also intense and serious, and he talks about things I don't understand and don't care about. She looked directly at her sister. If I'd married him, I would have been miserable. And so would he, because I don't want a partner. I want someone who makes me feel safe. The honesty in her sister's voice caught Celine off guard. Then what do you want? I don't know. Charlotte laughed bitterly. Isn't that pathetic? I'm 20 years old, and I have no idea what I actually want because I've spent my entire life being told what I should want. She wiped her eyes. You're brave, Celine. Braver than I'll ever be. Because you choose things. You fight for things. You don't just wait for life to happen to you. I'm not brave, Celine said softly. I'm terrified. But you do it anyway. Charlotte smiled, and it was sad and genuine. That's what makes it brave. For a long moment, they stood there in the snow, two sisters who'd been pitted against each other their entire lives, finally seeing each other clearly. I need to leave, Celine said finally. After tonight, I can't stay here. I know. Charlotte's voice was barely a whisper. Will you write to me? Wherever you go? If you want me to. I do. Charlotte stepped forward and did something she hadn't done in years. She hugged her sister. It was awkward and brief, but it was real. Be happy, Celine. Someone should be. Then she turned and walked back into the house, leaving Celine alone in the snow with tears freezing on her cheeks. Riker emerged from the barn, reading her expression with uncanny accuracy. We should leave tomorrow, he said quietly, before this gets worse. I can't just abandon the trading post. There are contracts, obligations, which I'll help you fulfill. Riker's voice was calm and practical. We'll spend the next week transitioning responsibilities, training your sister if she's willing, and making sure everything is properly documented. But Celine, you can't stay here. Not after tonight. He was right. She knew he was right. But the thought of leaving the only home she'd ever known, the business she'd poured her life into saving, the sister she'd just begun to understand. Where would we go? She asked. My ranch. The Judith Basin. Riker's expression softened. It's beautiful country, hard country, but beautiful. And I need someone with your skills to help me build something that will last. You're really asking me to marry you. I'm asking you to be my partner, Riker corrected. The marriage is just the legal framework. What I'm really asking is whether you're willing to build an empire beside someone who sees you as an equal. Celine looked up at the stars, brilliant and cold and infinite. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a sound that was both lonely and free. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll come with you. The week that followed was a strange, suspended time, like living in the space between lightning and thunder, waiting for the storm to fully break. Constance refused to speak to Celine. She moved through the house like a ghost, her face set in lines of bitter disappointment, directing all her attention toward Charlotte and acting as if her eldest daughter had simply ceased to exist. Charlotte, to everyone's surprise, began asking questions about the business. It started small, inquiring about inventory systems, asking how to read freight invoices, wanting to understand the account ledgers. Celine, grateful for any positive interaction, taught her sister everything she could. And slowly, grudgingly, she began to see signs of intelligence that had been buried beneath years of learned helplessness. "Why do we pay the Carter Freight Company at all?" Charlotte asked one afternoon, frowning at a stack of invoices. "If they're cheating us, why not use someone else?" "Because they're the only major freight company within 100 miles, Celine explained. "They have a monopoly. Then we should break it." Charlotte's blue eyes were suddenly sharp with something that looked almost like anger. "Find smaller operators, combine their routes, create our own shipping network. It would take time, but it would work," Celine finished, staring at her sister in amazement. "Charlotte, that's brilliant." Charlotte flushed with pleasure, genuine pleasure, not the artificial blush she used when flirting. "Really?" "Really." Celine pulled out a ledger and began making notes. "We'd need to map the existing routes, identify reliable operators, negotiate contracts." She looked up. "Are you serious about this? Because if you are, I can show you how to do it, but it won't be easy." "Nothing worth doing is easy," Charlotte said, and there was an echo of Celine's own determination in her voice. "You've been telling me that my whole life. I'm finally ready to listen." They worked together late into the night, and for the first time in their lives, they worked as genuine partners rather than rivals for their mother's approval. It felt strange and fragile and surprisingly right. Meanwhile, Riker was making his own preparations. He sent telegrams to his ranch manager, arranged for supplies, and began quietly investigating the Carter Freight Company's business practices. What he found made his expression darken with cold fury. "They're not just cheating you," he told Celine one evening. "They're running the same scheme on every small business in the territory. Fraudulent weight charges, fake express fees, inflated fuel costs. It's systematic theft." "Can we prove it?" "You already did." Riker gestured to the documentation Celine had compiled. "This is enough evidence to bring charges. The question is whether anyone will care." "The Territorial Commerce Board should care," Celine said slowly. "If we can show this is widespread, not just an isolated incident, then we'd need testimony from other business owners." Riker's eyes gleamed with something that might have been respect or might have been predatory satisfaction. "Think any of them would be brave enough to stand against the Carters?" Celine thought about the merchants and traders she knew, hard-working, honest people who'd been quietly suffering under the same exploitative system. If someone leads, others will follow. People are tired of being cheated. Then let's give them a leader. Over the next 3 days, Celine and Riker visited every trading post, general store, and supply depot within a day's ride. They brought evidence, explained the pattern, and asked a simple question. "Are you willing to fight back?" Some people refused out of fear, but others, more than Celine had dared hope, were ready for war. The general store owner in Timber Creek pulled out his own records showing identical fraudulent charges. The mining supply depot in Silver Ridge had documentation going back 3 years. Even the small fur trading post run by a French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste produced meticulously kept journals proving systematic theft. "They think we are stupid because we live far from cities," Baptiste said, his accent thick but his eyes sharp as knife blades. "They think frontier people don't read, don't calculate, don't remember. But I remember everything." He tapped his journal. "Every lie, every stolen dollar, and I am ready to make them answer." By the end of the week, Celine had compiled testimony from 14 different businesses representing more than $20,000 in fraudulent charges. The evidence was irrefutable. "We take this to the Territorial Commerce Board," Riker said, reviewing the final documentation, "and we do it publicly. Make sure every newspaper in Montana Territory knows what the Carters have been doing." "They'll retaliate," Celine warned. "Jonathan Carter doesn't forgive threats to his business. Let him try." Riker's smile was cold and sharp. "I've been building alliances in this territory for 12 years. He's been making enemies. Let's see which strategy serves us better." The night before they were scheduled to leave for Fort Benton to file the formal complaint, Constance finally broke her silence. Celine was in the office, finishing the last of the transition documents, when her mother appeared in the doorway. She looked older than Celine remembered, or perhaps she was simply seeing her clearly for the first time. The careful cosmetics couldn't quite hide the lines around Constance's eyes, the thinness of her frame beneath the expensive dress, the tremor in her hands that spoke of illness or exhaustion or both. "You're really leaving," Constance said flatly. "Yes?" Celine didn't look up from her work. "With a man you've known for less than 2 weeks?" "Yes." "You're a fool." Celine set down her pen very carefully. "Perhaps, but I'd rather be a fool who chose her own path than someone who spent her entire life waiting for someone else to save her." Constance's face twisted with something that might have been pain. "I tried to save you. Both of you. I tried to give you futures, to teach you how to survive in a world that destroys women who don't know their place. You tried to make Charlotte into a commodity and me into a workhorse," Celine corrected quietly. "Those aren't futures, they're prisons. You think you're so much smarter than me." Constance moved into the room, and Celine noticed how unsteady her steps were. "You think you figured out some secret I was too stupid to understand. But you're wrong. The world doesn't reward women for being strong or smart or capable. It punishes them. And one day you'll wake up and realize that all your strength has gotten you is loneliness and exhaustion." "Maybe," Celine acknowledged, "but at least I'll have chosen it." Constance laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Your father said something similar once. Before this territory broke him, before the debts and the failures and the endless struggle wore him down to nothing." She looked directly at Celine, and her eyes were glittering with unshed tears. "You're so much like him, it terrifies me, and I couldn't save him either." The words hung in the air between them, the closest thing to honesty they'd shared in years. Celine felt something shift in her chest, some small crack in the wall of resentment she'd built around her heart. "I'm not asking you to save me, Mother," she said softly. "I'm asking you to let me go." Constance was silent for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Your grandmother's ring," she said, setting it on the desk. "She gave it to me when I married your father, told me it was for my eldest daughter." Her voice cracked slightly. "I always meant to give it to Charlotte because she was the one who would make a good marriage. But you're the eldest, and despite everything, I'm still your mother." Celine picked up the box with trembling hands. Inside was a simple gold band set with a small sapphire. Nothing elaborate or expensive, but beautiful in its understated elegance. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me." Constance turned toward the door, her back rigid with forced composure. "Just be careful. The world is cruel to women who refuse to pretend they're weak." "I know." "And Celine?" Constance paused in the doorway without turning around. "If it doesn't work, if he turns out to be like all the others, you can come back. I won't make it easy, but you can come back." Then she was gone, leaving Celine alone with her grandmother's ring and the painful knowledge that even damaged love was still love. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Celine woke before sunrise, as she always did, and dressed in her warmest traveling clothes. Everything she owned fit into 2 leather bags, a lifetime of possessions reduced to less than 50 pounds. She found Riker in the barn, already preparing the horses. His own buckskin had recovered from its injured hoof, and he'd purchased a second horse for Celine, a sturdy gray mare with intelligent eyes and a calm temperament. "Her name's Tempest," Riker said, stroking the mare's neck. "I bought her from a rancher who was selling off his stock. He said she's the smartest horse he ever owned, but too independent for most riders." He smiled. "Reminded me of someone." Celine ran her hand along Tempest's shoulder, and the horse turned to look at her with an expression that was almost knowing. "She's beautiful. She's yours." Riker handed her the reins. "Everything I have is yours now. We're partners, remember?" The word still felt strange on her tongue. Partners. Equals. Not servant and master, not decoration and protector, but 2 people building something together. They loaded their bags and made final preparations while the sun rose over the mountains. Charlotte appeared in the courtyard wearing a practical dress Celine had never seen before, something suitable for work rather than socializing. "I'm going to do it," Charlotte announced without preamble. "The freight network. I've already sent letters to 3 small operators, and Baptiste agreed to help me coordinate the northern routes." Her chin lifted with something that looked almost like pride. "I'm going to break the Carter monopoly." "Charlotte, that's dangerous," Celine warned. "Jonathan Carter won't just accept losing business, he'll fight back." "Good. Charlotte's blue eyes blazed with unexpected steel. Let him. I'm tired of being afraid. Celine looked at her younger sister, really looked at her, and saw someone she'd never noticed before. Someone capable and determined and ready to fight. You're going to be extraordinary, she said softly. I learned from the best. Charlotte stepped forward and hugged her sister tightly. Write to me. Tell me everything. And if you need help, if you ever need anything, I'll come. I know. They held each other for a moment longer. Then Charlotte stepped back, wiping her eyes. Now go, before I start crying and ruin my dramatic exit. Constance watched from the window but didn't come outside. Celine looked up at that window one last time, then turned Tempest toward the road and didn't look back. They rode north through country that grew progressively wilder and more beautiful. The valleys opened up into rolling grasslands, punctuated by pine forests and dramatic rock formations. Elk grazed in the meadows. Eagles circled overhead, and the mountains rose in the distance like the backbone of the world. Riker was a comfortable traveling companion, quiet when silence felt right, conversational when she wanted to talk, and always aware of the practical necessities of frontier travel. They made camp each night with practiced efficiency, and Celine found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't in years. Tell me about your ranch, she said one evening as they sat by the fire. It's big, Riker said with a slight smile. 20,000 acres in the Judith Basin. Good grazing land, reliable water, and enough timber for building. I've got about 200 head of cattle right now, but that number should double in the next 2 years. How many employees? 15 ranch hands, a cook, and a manager named Jacob McCall, who's been with me since the beginning. Riker poked the fire with a stick. They're good men, loyal, but they're going to be skeptical about a woman having any authority. Because women don't understand cattle ranching? Celine's voice was dry. Because most women they've encountered treated ranching as something men did while women stayed inside and looked decorative. Riker met her eyes. You're going to shatter their expectations, probably make them uncomfortable, definitely make some of them angry. And I'm telling you now so you're prepared. Riker's expression was serious. I'll support you completely. But this is going to be a fight. You'll have to prove yourself every single day until they accept that you're not just my wife. You're my partner in running the operation. Celine considered this. Good. Riker blinked. Good? I've been proving myself every single day for 23 years, Celine said calmly. At least at your ranch, I'll be doing it while building something that actually belongs to me instead of constantly saving something that's falling apart. Riker laughed. A genuine, delighted sound. You're going to terrify them. Probably. They reached Fort Benton 2 days later. The town sat at the head of navigation on the Missouri River, and it hummed with the chaotic energy of a frontier boom town. Steamboats unloaded cargo at the docks. Merchants shouted about their wares. Cowboys and miners and trappers crowded the streets in a diverse mass of humanity that made Celine's small valley seem quiet and isolated by comparison. The Territorial Commerce Board office was a solid brick building near the center of town. Riker and Celine walked in carrying their compiled evidence, and the clerk's expression shifted from bored indifference to sharp attention when he saw the thickness of their documentation. This is a formal complaint against the Carter Freight Company, Riker said, placing the folders on the counter. Systematic fraud affecting 14 businesses across 3 counties. We have invoices, shipping manifests, testimony, and mathematical proof of deliberate overcharging. The clerk's eyes widened. Sir, these are serious accusations. The Carter family is powerful, Riker finished. Yes, I'm aware. They're also criminals, and this evidence proves it. The clerk swallowed hard. I'll need to bring this to the board chairman. But sir, you should know that Jonathan Carter has significant influence. Filing this complaint could make you enemies. I'm counting on it, Riker said pleasantly. Please ensure the chairman reviews this today. We'll be staying at the Grand Union Hotel. They left the office and walked through the crowded streets toward the hotel. Celine felt the weight of what they'd just done settling over her like a physical presence. There's no going back now, she said quietly. No, Riker agreed, but that was always true. From the moment I took your hand in your mother's dining room, we were committed to this path. The Grand Union Hotel was the finest establishment in Fort Benton, 3 stories of solid construction with glass windows and carpeted floors. The lobby was full of prosperous-looking men conducting business, and Celine felt suddenly conscious of her travel-stained clothes and practical demeanor. Riker approached the desk without hesitation. 2 rooms, please. One for myself and one for Miss Mercer. The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly, traveling together but maintaining propriety. He produced a registration book. How long will you be staying? However long it takes to see justice done, Riker said, signing his name with a flourish. They were settling into their respective rooms when a knock came at Celine's door. She opened it to find a hotel porter holding a sealed envelope. Letter for you, miss. Just delivered. Celine tipped him and closed the door, turning the envelope over in her hands. Her name was written in elegant script she didn't recognize. She broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Miss Mercer, I understand you filed a complaint against my freight company. This is unfortunate and unnecessary. I'm prepared to offer a generous settlement in exchange for withdrawing your accusations. Please meet me in the hotel restaurant at 8 o'clock this evening to discuss terms. I'm certain we can reach an agreement that satisfies everyone. Jonathan Carter. Celine read it twice, then carried it next door to Riker's room. He scanned the letter and his expression went cold. He thinks he can buy you off. Should I go? Yes. Riker's eyes glittered dangerously. But not alone, and not to negotiate. At precisely 8 o'clock, Celine and Riker descended to the hotel restaurant. Jonathan Carter was already there, a heavy-set man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. He rose as they approached, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Miss Mercer and Mr. Vale, I presume. He gestured to the empty chairs. Please sit. I've taken the liberty of ordering wine. We're not here to drink with you, Celine said flatly. Carter's smile tightened. Straight to business, then. I respect that. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 to withdraw your complaint. That's more than generous compensation for any misunderstandings. Misunderstandings, Riker repeated slowly. Is that what you call systematic theft? I call it the cost of doing business in a difficult territory, Carter said smoothly. Freight operations are expensive. Sometimes charges are estimated incorrectly. It's hardly fraud. Then you won't mind the Commerce Board reviewing every invoice you've issued in the past 3 years, Celine said. I'm sure they'll find all those estimation errors were honest mistakes. Carter's expression hardened. Miss Mercer, you seem like an intelligent woman. Surely you understand that making enemies of powerful families is unwise. The frontier is dangerous. Accidents happen. Businesses fail. Sometimes people get hurt. The threat was unmistakable. Celine felt anger flare in her chest, white-hot and cleansing. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice deadly calm. I've spent the last 4 years keeping a failing business alive through sheer determination. I've negotiated with suppliers who tried to cheat me, dealt with lenders who tried to steal from me, and survived a territory that's killed stronger people than you. She leaned forward. So when you threaten me, understand that I've been threatened by experts, and I'm still here. Carter's face flushed red. You're making a mistake. No, Riker interjected quietly. You made the mistake. You assumed that because you've gotten away with theft for years, you'd continue getting away with it. But times are changing, Mr. Carter. The frontier is growing up, and there's no room in civilization for predators like you. Carter stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This conversation is over, but Miss Mercer, Mr. Vale, you'll regret this decision. I promise you that. He stormed out of the restaurant, leaving them alone at the table. Celine realized her hands were shaking. He's going to come after us. Probably, Riker agreed. But we have the law on our side, documented evidence, and more than a dozen witnesses ready to testify. He reached across the table and took her hand. We're going to win this, Celine. And when we do, every small business owner in Montana Territory will know that they don't have to accept being cheated. She looked at their joined hands, her rough, work-scarred fingers against his calloused palm. Partners, equals, fighting together. I believe you, she said softly. The Territorial Commerce Board hearing was scheduled for 3 days later. In the intervening time, Riker and Celine prepared their case with meticulous care. They organized evidence, rehearsed testimony, and met with the other business owners who'd agreed to testify. Baptiste arrived from Silver Ridge with his journals and a quiet determination that reminded Celine of stone, patient, immovable, and harder than it looked. The store owner from Timber Creek brought his wife, who turned out to have kept even more detailed records than her husband. One by one, the witnesses gathered, and Celine watched a community forming around their shared grievance. "This is bigger than just the freight company," she said to Riker the night before the hearing. "This is about whether frontier people will stand together or let themselves be picked off one by one." "Revolution usually starts with something small," Riker observed. "Unjust taxes, unfair laws, systematic theft. The specifics don't matter as much as the principle that ordinary people can fight back against entrenched power and win." The hearing room was packed. The three-member Commerce Board sat at a raised table at the front, their expressions carefully neutral. Jonathan Carter sat with two lawyers radiating confidence. And behind Celine and Riker, 14 business owners sat in solidarity, their presence a silent testimony to the reach of the fraud. The board chairman, a thin, severe-looking man named Harrison, called the hearing to order. "This is a formal complaint filed by Miss Celine Mercer and Mr. Riker Vale against the Carter Freight Company, alleging systematic fraud in billing practices. Miss Mercer, you may present your evidence." Celine stood and felt the weight of every eye in the room settling on her shoulders. For just a moment she heard her mother's voice in her head. "Women don't challenge powerful men in public." Then she heard Riker's voice, steady and certain. "You're extraordinary." She chose which voice to believe. "Gentlemen," she began, and her voice was clear and strong. "Over the past 18 months, I documented systematic overcharging by the Carter Freight Company affecting my family's trading post. The fraud follows a consistent pattern: inflated weight charges, fees for express delivery on delayed shipments, and billing for routes never actually traveled." She walked them through the evidence methodically, showing invoices beside shipping manifests, demonstrating mathematical impossibilities in weight calculations, presenting testimony from wagon drivers who'd actually made the deliveries. With each piece of evidence, she watched the board members' expressions shift from skepticism to interest to concern. Then she delivered the killing blow. "This fraud isn't limited to my business. I have testimony from 14 separate businesses across 3 counties, all showing identical patterns of systematic overcharging. The total documented theft exceeds $20,000 over 3 years." The murmur that went through the courtroom was like thunder. Carter's lead lawyer stood. "These are baseless accusations from disgruntled customers who kept meticulous records," Celine interrupted calmly. "Who can prove every claim with physical evidence. Who represent a diverse cross-section of the frontier economy." She looked directly at Jonathan Carter. "The question isn't whether the fraud occurred. The evidence proves it did. The question is what consequences there will be." For 3 hours they presented testimony. Baptiste spoke in his accented English about being treated like an ignorant foreigner while being robbed blind. The Timber Creek store owner's wife demonstrated calculations that proved fraudulent weight charges. One by one, ordinary frontier people stood up and told their stories of being systematically cheated by a powerful family who thought they were untouchable. By the end, even Carter's lawyers looked shaken. The board chairman called a recess to deliberate. The room erupted in conversation. Celine felt Riker's hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "We haven't won yet." "We've already won," Riker corrected. "Whether the board rules in our favor or not, you've shown every person in this room that ordinary people can stand up to power. That's a victory that can't be taken back." When the board returned, Chairman Harrison's expression was grave. "This board finds the evidence of systematic fraud overwhelming and disturbing. The Carter Freight Company is hereby fined $20,000 in restitution to be distributed among the affected businesses. Additionally, Mr. Jonathan Carter is barred from operating freight services in Montana Territory for a period of 5 years." The courtroom exploded. Carter's face went purple with rage. His lawyers were shouting objections. But underneath the chaos, Celine heard something else. The sound of ordinary people cheering. They'd won. Outside the courthouse, the Montana sun blazed down on a scene that looked more like a celebration than the aftermath of a legal hearing. Business owners who'd been strangers 3 weeks ago were shaking hands and clapping each other on the shoulders. Baptiste was explaining his northern route connections to the Timber Creek couple, already forming the foundation of the independent freight network Charlotte had envisioned. And at the center of it all stood Celine, surrounded by people who wanted to thank her, to tell her she'd changed everything, to promise their support if she ever needed it. Riker watched from a few feet away, his gray eyes warm with something that might have been pride, or might have been deeper than that. When the crowd finally began to disperse, he moved to her side and spoke quietly. "We should leave Fort Benton today, before Carter has time to regroup." Celine nodded, though exhaustion was beginning to settle into her bones. They'd won the legal battle, but she wasn't naive enough to believe that was the end of it. Men like Jonathan Carter didn't accept defeat gracefully. They nursed their wounds and waited for opportunities to strike back. They collected their belongings from the Grand Union Hotel and rode north before noon. The sky was clear and impossibly blue, and the grasslands stretched out in every direction like an ocean frozen in shades of gold and green. For the first few miles, neither of them spoke, letting the rhythm of the horses and the vast silence of the frontier wash away the tension of the past week. Finally, Riker broke the quiet. "You know he's going to come after us." "I know." Celine adjusted her grip on Tempest's reins. "The question is how and when, not if. Men like Carter don't forgive public humiliation." She glanced at Riker. "You must have known that when you encouraged me to file the complaint." "I knew," Riker admitted. "But I also knew that some fights are worth having, even when they're dangerous. The frontier is changing, Celine. Either we build something worth preserving, or we let predators like Carter turn it into a feeding ground." They made camp that night beside a creek that ran clear and cold from the mountains. While Riker tended the horses, Celine gathered wood and built a fire with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd been doing it her entire life. The familiar tasks were soothing, normal in a way nothing else had been for weeks. "Tell me about your family," she said, as they sat beside the flames, eating the simple meal of beans and cornbread they'd prepared. "You know everything about mine, but I know almost nothing about yours." Riker was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Not much to tell. My father was a banker in Boston, conservative, proper, convinced that the only respectable life was one lived in an office wearing a suit." He smiled without humor. "I was a terrible disappointment to him." "Why?" "Because I wanted dirt under my fingernails and open sky overhead instead of ledgers and drawing rooms." Riker poked the fire with a stick. "I left when I was 19, came west with nothing but my education and enough money for a train ticket. Spent 5 years working other people's ranches, learning everything I could, saving every dollar." His voice softened slightly. "My mother died while I was gone. I didn't find out for 3 months because my father never wrote to tell me." Celine felt something twist in her chest. "I'm sorry." "So was I. Still am." Riker looked up, and his gray eyes reflected the firelight. "But I made my choice, and I've built something out here that matters, something that would have been impossible if I'd stayed in Boston pretending to be someone I wasn't." "Do you ever regret it, leaving everything behind?" "Every time I think about my mother," Riker said honestly, "but never when I look at what I've built. And definitely not now." He met her gaze across the fire. "What about you? Any regrets about leaving your family?" Celine considered this question carefully. "I regret that it had to end the way it did. I regret that my mother and I could never find a way to understand each other. But leaving?" She shook her head. "No. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing my own path instead of just surviving someone else's. Even though that path leads into the unknown? Especially because it does." Celine smiled slightly. "The known was slowly killing me. At least the unknown offers possibility." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. Then Riker spoke again, his voice careful. "We should get married soon, before we reach the ranch." Celine's heart stuttered. She'd known this was coming, had agreed to it, in fact, but the reality of it still felt enormous and terrifying. "Why before?" "Because my ranch hands are traditional men who won't respect a woman they see as just my paramour," Riker said bluntly. "If we show up married, you have legitimate authority. If we show up together but unmarried, you're just the woman I'm sleeping with, and nothing you say or do will matter to them." The pragmatic reasoning should have felt cold, but somehow it didn't. Riker was being honest about the obstacles she'd face, not trying to minimize them or pretend they didn't exist. "Where would we do it?" she asked. "There's a small settlement called Judith Gap, about 2 days from here. It has a justice of the peace." Riker hesitated. "It won't be fancy. No church, no celebration, just the legal formality." "Good," Celine said firmly. "Fancy weddings are for people who care more about appearances than substance." Riker's expression shifted into something that might have been relief or gratitude or both. You're sure about this? Once we're married, there's no going back to your old life, no matter what happens. I was never going back anyway, Celine said. The moment I took your hand in my mother's dining room, that door closed. Marriage is just making official what's already true. And what's that? Celine met his eyes across the dying fire. That we're partners, that we're building something together, that whatever comes next, we face it as equals. Riker stood and walked around the fire to where she sat. He held out his hand and she took it, letting him pull her to her feet. For a moment they stood there in the firelight, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, far enough that it wasn't quite an embrace. I can't promise it will be easy, Riker said quietly. The ranch is hard work. The men will resist you, and we have enemies now who won't forget what we did. I know. I can't promise I'll always get it right. I've never been married before, never had a partner in anything that mattered this much. Neither have I. But I can promise, Riker continued, and his voice was steady as bedrock, that I will never ask you to be smaller than you are, never expect you to pretend weakness, never treat you as anything less than my equal in every way that matters. Celine felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes and refused to let them fall. That's all I've ever wanted, she whispered. To be seen for who I actually am instead of who people think I should be. Then let me see you, Riker said. All of you. The strength and the vulnerability. The certainty and the fear. The woman who can face down corrupt businessmen in a courtroom and the woman who's terrified of trusting someone enough to build a life with them. How did you How? Because I'm terrified too, Riker admitted. I've spent 12 years building an empire alone because it was safer than risking partnership, easier than trusting someone else to understand what I'm trying to create. His hands tightened slightly on hers. But the moment I saw you in that courtyard, rebuilding wagon wheels in a snowstorm, like it was the most natural thing in the world, I knew. You were worth the risk. Celine closed the remaining distance between them, and when she kissed him, it wasn't gentle or tentative or careful. It was fierce and certain and full of all the things she'd never learned how to say with words. Riker responded in kind, one hand coming up to cup the back of her head, the other settling at the small of her back, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Celine rested her forehead against his chest and felt his heart hammering beneath her cheek. 2 days to Judith Gap, she said. 2 days, Riker agreed. They rode into Judith Gap late on a Tuesday afternoon. The settlement was barely worthy of the name, a handful of rough buildings clustered around a trading post, with a small cabin that served as both the justice of the peace's office and his home. The man who answered their knock was in his 60s, with the leathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the sun and the sharp eyes of someone who didn't miss much. "Help you folks?" he asked, looking between them with undisguised curiosity. "We'd like to get married," Riker said simply. "Today, if possible." The justice's eyebrows rose. "Today? You're in a hurry." "We're practical," Celine corrected. "Is there a legal reason to wait?" "None that I know of." The old man stepped back, gesturing them inside. "Name's Samuel Hutchins. Been marrying folks in this territory for 20-odd years, and I've learned not to ask too many questions about why." He shuffled toward a desk covered in papers. "I'll need names, ages, and sworn statements that you're both entering this marriage of your own free will." The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. There were no flowers, no music, no witnesses beyond Samuel Hutchins himself. Riker placed his grandmother's ring, a simple band of gold he produced from his pocket, on Celine's finger beside the sapphire ring her mother had given her. She had nothing to give him in return, but he seemed unbothered by the asymmetry. "Do you, Riker Vale, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Samuel asked in his matter-of-fact tone. "I do. And do you, Celine Mercer, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Celine looked at Riker's face, strong and weathered and completely certain, and felt something settle into place in her chest. "I do." "Then by the authority vested in me by Montana Territory, I pronounce you married." Samuel made a notation in his record book. "You can kiss her if you want, or not. Up to you." Riker kissed her. It was brief and almost chaste, but there was a promise in it that made Celine's breath catch. They signed the marriage certificate, paid Samuel his fee, and walked out into the late afternoon sunlight as husband and wife. "Well, Mrs. Vale," Riker said, and there was something almost wondering in his voice. "How does it feel?" Celine tested the name silently, turning it over in her mind. Mrs. Vale. A new identity. A new life. "Strange," she admitted, "but right, like putting on a coat that was made specifically for you." They spent their wedding night in the small room above the trading post, the only lodging Judith Gap had to offer. It was sparse and simple, with a narrow bed and a single window overlooking the grasslands. But it was private, and it was theirs, and that was enough. Later, lying in the darkness with Riker's steady breathing beside her, Celine stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had happened in the past 3 weeks. She'd gone from being the invisible daughter to a married woman with a new name and a new life stretching out before her like uncharted territory. "Are you awake?" Riker's voice was quiet in the darkness. "Yes." "What are you thinking?" Celine considered lying, offering something simple and safe. But they'd promised honesty, so she gave him the truth. "I'm thinking that 3 weeks ago, I was convinced I'd spend the rest of my life alone, working myself to death to save a business that would never actually belong to me. And now I'm married to someone I barely know, heading toward a life I can't predict, trusting that somehow it will work out." "Terrified?" "Absolutely," Celine admitted. "But also," she struggled to find the right words, "also more alive than I've felt in years. Like I've been holding my breath for so long I forgot what real air felt like." Riker rolled onto his side, and she felt him looking at her in the darkness. "I meant what I said earlier, about being equals, about building something together." "I know. Do you?" His hand found hers under the blanket. "Because I need you to understand that I'm not just offering you a place in my life. I'm offering you a place in my work. Real authority, real decision-making power. The ranch hands won't like it, and there will be days when you'll want to strangle me for putting you in impossible situations. But I need a partner, Celine, not a decoration." "Then that's what you'll have," Celine said firmly. "But Riker, I need you to understand something too. I've spent my entire life being useful without being valued. If you ever ask me to shut up and look pretty while you make the real decisions, if you ever patronize me or dismiss my ideas because I'm a woman, I'll leave. I don't care if we're married. I won't go back to being invisible." "Fair enough," Riker said quietly, "though I'd like to think I've proven I'm not that kind of man." "You have," Celine acknowledged, "but I needed to say it anyway, so we both know where we stand." They fell asleep with their hands still linked, and Celine dreamed of wide-open spaces and work that actually belonged to her. The next morning, they rode toward the Judith Basin. The landscape changed gradually, the grasslands giving way to rolling hills dotted with pine trees, then rising into foothills that promised mountains beyond. It was beautiful country, wild and harsh, and full of the kind of dangerous potential that made empires or broke them. Late in the afternoon, they crested a ridge, and Riker reined in his horse. "There," he said, and his voice carried a note of unmistakable pride. Celine looked where he was pointing and felt her breath catch. The valley below was vast and green, bisected by a river that gleamed silver in the afternoon light. Cattle, hundreds of them, grazed across the grasslands in scattered groups. Buildings clustered in the distance, a large ranch house, barns, corrals, storage structures. And beyond it all, the mountains rose like sentinels, their peaks still white with snow even in late spring. 20,000 acres, Riker said quietly. Every inch of it earned with blood and sweat and years of work that nearly killed me. He looked at her. "And now it's ours." They rode down into the valley as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. As they drew closer to the ranch buildings, Celine could make out more details. Sturdy construction, well-maintained fences, evidence of careful planning and hard work. A handful of men were working in the corrals, and they stopped what they were doing to watch the approaching riders with undisguised curiosity. One man separated from the group and walked toward them, a tall, lean figure with sun-bleached hair and the rolling gait of someone who spent more time on horseback than on foot. As he got closer, Celine could see he was somewhere in his 40s, with a weathered face and eyes the color of faded denim. "Boss," the man said, touching his hat to Riker. Then his gaze slid to Celine, and she saw the flicker of surprise before he controlled his expression. Wasn't expecting you back with company. Jacob, this is my wife, Celine, Riker said, and there was a quiet challenge in his voice. Celine, this is Jacob McCall, my ranch manager. Jacob's eyes widened fractionally, but to his credit, he recovered quickly. Ma'am, he said, touching his hat again, welcome to the Vale Ranch. Thank you, Celine said, studying him carefully. His tone was polite, but she could see the questions in his eyes, the uncertainty about what her presence meant. We got married in Judith Gap yesterday, Riker continued, dismounting and moving to help Celine down from Tempest. Celine will be my full partner in running the ranch. I want everyone to understand that her authority is equal to mine. Jacob's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Boss, can I speak with you? Privately? Anything you need to say can be said in front of my wife, Riker said flatly. With respect, sir, I don't think... That's an order, Jacob. Riker's voice was pleasant, but absolutely firm. Celine is not a guest. She's not a decoration. She's my partner in every aspect of this operation, and the sooner everyone accepts that, the smoother things will go. Jacob looked between them, clearly struggling with something. Finally, he said, The men aren't going to like this. The men will adjust, Riker said, or they'll find employment elsewhere. Celine could see the older man wrestling with his response, and she decided to intervene before the situation escalated further. Mr. McCall, she said quietly, I understand this is unexpected, and I'm sure you're wondering what my qualifications are beyond being Riker's wife. Jacob shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, I didn't mean to imply... Yes, you did, Celine interrupted calmly, and you have every right to wonder. So let me be clear. I've spent the last 4 years running a trading post that should have failed but didn't because I'm very good at logistics, financial management, and solving problems other people think are impossible. She met his eyes steadily. I don't know cattle ranching yet, but I learn fast, I work hard, and I don't expect special treatment. What I do expect is to be judged on my competence, not my gender. Jacob stared at her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth twitched. You always this direct? Always, Celine confirmed. Good, Jacob said. I hate people who talk in circles. He looked at Riker. I still think you should have warned us. But if she's half as capable as you say, we could use the help, especially with the McKendrick situation. Riker's expression sharpened. What McKendrick situation? Come on up to the house, Jacob said. We need to talk. The ranch house was larger than Celine had expected, a 2-story log structure with a wide porch and windows that faced both the valley and the mountains. Inside, it was furnished simply but comfortably, with evidence of masculine practicality in every corner. No decorative touches, no unnecessary frills, just solid furniture and functional spaces. Jacob led them to a large room that served as both office and meeting space. A detailed map of the valley covered one wall, marked with property boundaries and grazing areas. He gestured to the map, pointing to a section along the northern boundary. Connor McKendrick has been pushing his cattle onto our land for the past 3 weeks, Jacob said bluntly. Started small, just a few heads straying across the boundary, but it's gotten worse. Last week we found more than 100 of his cattle grazing in our north pasture. And when you confronted him, Riker's voice was dangerously quiet. He claimed the boundary markers were wrong, said his family's been using that land for years, and just because you bought the deed doesn't make it yours. Jacob's expression was grim. He's testing you, boss, seeing if you'll stand up to him or let him take what he wants. Celine studied the map, her mind already analyzing the situation. Who is Connor McKendrick? Another cattle rancher, Riker said. Been in the basin for 15 years, and he thinks that gives him more rights than anyone else. He's powerful, well-connected, and used to getting his way. Sounds familiar, Celine murmured, thinking of Jonathan Carter. Riker caught her meaning and smiled grimly. Yes, same type of predator, different territory. He turned back to Jacob. What have we done about it so far? Driven his cattle back across the boundary 3 times, posted extra guards on the north range, and I sent him a formal letter stating our property rights. Jacob's jaw tightened. He ignored it. Sent word back that if we didn't like his cattle on our land, maybe we should reconsider who actually owns it. That's a direct challenge, Celine said. Both men looked at her. Yes, ma'am, Jacob confirmed. So what are our options, she asked, looking at Riker. We can involve the Territorial Land Office, prove our claim legally, Riker said. But that takes time, and meanwhile McKendrick continues to use our resources. We could drive his cattle off by force, Jacob suggested. Make it clear we're willing to defend our property. Which could escalate into violence, Celine said thoughtfully. And even if we win, it makes us look like aggressors. Riker's eyebrows rose. What are you thinking? Celine moved closer to the map, tracing the boundary line with her finger. This disputed area, what makes it valuable? Water, Jacob said immediately. There's a creek that runs through it, best water source on the North Range. And McKendrick's property. Does it have adequate water? Jacob frowned, considering. It used to, but he's overgrazed it for years. His creeks run dry in summer now. So he's not challenging our boundary out of principle, Celine said slowly. He's desperate for water, and he thinks bullying us is easier than managing his own resources properly. Riker was watching her with intense focus. Go on. If we approach this as a resource conflict rather than a property dispute, we have more options, Celine continued. We could offer limited water rights in exchange for clear recognition of our boundary. Give him enough to keep his cattle alive, but not enough to support his current herd size, forcing him to reduce his numbers. Jacob looked skeptical. Why would we negotiate with someone who's trying to steal from us? Because negotiation from a position of strength isn't weakness, Celine said. It's strategy. If we handle this right, we get formal recognition of our property rights. We appear reasonable rather than aggressive, and we force McKendrick to make the hard choices about his own mismanagement. She paused. Plus, if he refuses a fair offer, we have proof that he's acting in bad faith, which strengthens our case if we do have to go legal or use force. Riker was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes studying the map. Then he smiled, a sharp, fierce expression that reminded Celine of a wolf. That's brilliant. It's pragmatic, Celine corrected. We need allies in this basin, not enemies. If we can turn a potential conflict into a structured agreement, we're stronger for it. Jacob cleared his throat. Boss, no disrespect to your wife, but McKendrick isn't the negotiating type. He's more likely to shoot someone than shake their hand. Then we make sure he has witnesses, Celine said calmly. Other ranchers from the basin, people with their own interests in seeing property rights respected and water resources managed fairly. She looked at Riker. This isn't just about one boundary dispute. It's about establishing how conflicts get resolved in this territory. Riker nodded slowly. We'd need to approach the other ranchers carefully. Get them to see this as setting precedent rather than interfering in our business. I can handle that, Celine said. If you'll let me. Jacob made a strangled sound. Boss, are you seriously going to send your wife, who's been here less than 2 hours, to negotiate with Connor McKendrick and the other basin ranchers? No, Riker said, and Celine felt a flash of disappointment before he continued. I'm going to send my partner and her extraordinary strategic mind to propose a solution that benefits everyone except the people trying to steal from us. He looked at Jacob directly. And you're going to support her in this because she's right. Her plan is solid, and quite frankly, we've tried your way, and it hasn't worked. The ranch manager's face flushed, but after a moment he nodded stiffly. Yes, sir. Good. Riker turned back to Celine. We'll need to move quickly. The longer this drags on, the more entrenched positions become. Can you draft a proposal tonight? I'll have it ready by morning, Celine promised. Jacob excused himself, clearly needing time to process the sudden shift in ranch hierarchy. When he was gone, Riker pulled Celine into his arms and kissed the top of her head. You've been here 2 hours, and you're already reorganizing my business strategies, he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. You said you wanted a partner, Celine reminded him. This is what partnership looks like. I know. Riker pulled back to look at her face. And for the record, watching you dismantle Jacob's assumptions with pure logic while staying completely calm was one of the most attractive things I've ever seen. Celine felt heat rise in her cheeks. I was just being practical. You were being extraordinary, Riker corrected. And I'm going to spend the next several decades proving to you that those two things aren't mutually exclusive. That night, while Riker showed her to their bedroom, a large space with windows overlooking the valley, Celine sat at his desk and drafted the water rights proposal. She laid out clear terms. McKendrick would receive limited access to the creek for a period of 5 years, sufficient to water a herd of no more than 500 cattle. In exchange, he would formally recognize the Vale Ranch's property boundaries, pay a nominal annual fee for the water rights, and agree to binding arbitration for any future disputes. The terms were fair but firm, generous enough to solve McKendrick's immediate problem, but structured to ensure he couldn't simply take what he wanted without consequences. When she finished, the moon was high overhead, and the ranch was silent except for the occasional sound of cattle settling for the night. She found Riker standing on the porch, looking out over the darkened valley. "It's beautiful," she said softly, moving to stand beside him. "It's ours," Riker said. "Yours and mine. Everything you see." He paused. "Are you happy?" Celine considered the question carefully. She was exhausted, uncertain about her reception among the ranch hands and facing immediate conflict with a hostile neighbor. Her family was hundreds of miles away, and she was married to a man she'd known for less than a month. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The next morning, Celine rode out with Riker and Jacob to visit the neighboring ranchers. They started with a man named Thomas Garrett, whose property bordered both the Vale Ranch and McKendrick's spread. Garrett was in his 50s, with the solid build and careful eyes of someone who'd survived the frontier through caution rather than recklessness. "Mrs. Vale," he said when Riker introduced her, and his tone was polite but reserved. "I heard Riker got married. Congratulations." "Thank you," Celine said. "I hope we're not interrupting your work." "Always time for neighbors," Garrett said, though his eyes kept drifting to Celine with barely concealed curiosity. "What brings you out this way?" Riker let Celine explain, and she laid out the McKendrick situation and her proposed solution clearly and concisely. Garrett listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Why should I care about your boundary dispute?" "Because it's not just about one boundary," Celine said calmly. "It's about whether property rights in this basin mean anything, or whether the man with the biggest herd and the least scruples gets to take what he wants." Garrett's eyes sharpened. "McKendrick's been expanding his herd for years, pushed right up against my southern fence last season." "Exactly," Celine said. "If we let him steal our water without consequences, what stops him from doing the same to you? But if we establish clear precedent that disputes get resolved through negotiation and binding agreements rather than force, everyone's property becomes more secure." "Including McKendrick's," Garrett pointed out. "Including everyone's," Celine agreed. "That's what makes it fair. We're not trying to punish him. We're trying to create a system where conflicts don't have to end in violence or legal battles that drain everyone's resources." Garrett studied her face for a long moment. "You know, Mrs. Vale, when I heard Riker married some woman from a trading post, I figured she'd be decorative, someone to make his house pretty and give him sons." He smiled slightly. "I'm glad I was wrong." "So am I," Celine said dryly. "All right," Garrett said. "I'll attend your meeting and support your proposal. But Mrs. Vale, McKendrick's not going to like being backed into a corner, even a generous corner." "I know," Celine said. "That's why we need witnesses." They spent the next 3 days visiting every rancher in the Judith Basin. Some were skeptical, some were supportive, and a few made it clear they thought a woman had no business involving herself in range management. But by the end, Celine had commitments from 8 ranchers to attend the meeting and support the water rights agreement. The meeting was set for Saturday afternoon at the Vale Ranch. Celine spent the intervening days learning everything she could about cattle ranching, water rights law, and the politics of the Judith Basin. The ranch hands watched her with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity, but she ignored their stares and focused on proving herself through competence rather than charm. On Friday evening, she was checking fence repairs in the east pasture when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast. She turned to see one of the younger ranch hands, a kid named Danny, who couldn't be more than 17, riding toward her at a gallop. "Mrs. Vale," he shouted, "there's trouble at the North Range." Celine's heart kicked hard against her ribs. "What kind of trouble?" "McKendrick's men are there, and they're armed." Celine didn't hesitate. "Get Jacob and Mr. Vale. Tell them to bring everyone who can ride and meet me at the north boundary." She was already swinging up into Tempest's saddle. "Now, Danny." The boy wheeled his horse and took off toward the ranch house. Celine kicked Tempest into a run, her mind racing through possibilities. McKendrick was making his move early, trying to intimidate them before the meeting could even happen. She reached the disputed area 15 minutes later to find 5 of McKendrick's men on Vale property, their horses standing in the creek while they watched McKendrick's cattle drink. They looked up as Celine approached, and she saw the moment they registered both her gender and her lack of backup. "Well now," one of them drawled, a thick-set man with a scar across his jaw. "Looks like Vale sends women to do his work now." Celine brought Tempest to a halt 20 feet from them, close enough to talk but far enough to retreat if necessary. "This is Vale property," she said clearly. "You're trespassing." The scarred man laughed. "That's not what Mr. McKendrick says. He says this land's been open range for years, and just because some Boston boy bought a piece of paper doesn't change that." "The law disagrees," Celine said calmly, though her heart was hammering. "And you have until the count of 10 to move those cattle back across the boundary." "Or what?" Another man edged his horse forward. "You going to shoot us, little lady?" Celine held their gazes steadily, acutely aware that she was alone and they were armed. "Or you'll have a lot of explaining to do when the other ranchers in this basin hear that McKendrick's men threatened a woman on her own property." She paused. "We have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow. Did Mr. McKendrick send you here specifically to make himself look like a coward who can't negotiate like a civilized man?" The scarred man's face darkened with anger. "You've got a smart mouth, oh! And you've got about 5 seconds before my husband and every hand on the Vale Ranch arrive with rifles," Celine interrupted. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to drive those cattle back across the boundary line. You're going to go back to McKendrick and tell him that intimidation tactics won't work. And you're going to pray that I'm feeling generous enough tomorrow not to mention this little incident to the territorial marshal." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Celine heard the sound she'd been praying for, multiple horses approaching at speed. She didn't turn to look, keeping her eyes locked on McKendrick's men, but she knew it was Riker and the ranch hands. The scarred man heard it too. His jaw clenched, and she saw him weighing his options: escalate and risk real violence, or retreat and live to fight another day. "This isn't over," he said finally. "No," Celine agreed, "but if you're smart, tomorrow it gets resolved without anyone getting hurt." The men wheeled their horses and drove the cattle back across the boundary line with rough efficiency. Celine sat perfectly still on Tempest, refusing to show the trembling that wanted to take over her body until they were gone. Then Riker was beside her, his face white with something that looked like fury and fear combined. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded. "You could have been killed." "I was thinking that we can't let them establish dominance through intimidation," Celine said, and was proud that her voice came out steady, and that someone needed to hold the line until backup arrived. "Someone, yes, but not you, not alone, not—" Riker broke off, his hands clenched on his reins. "Don't ever do that again." Celine looked at him directly. "I thought you wanted a partner. Or did you mean that only when it's convenient and safe?" The question hung between them. Jacob and the other ranch hands had pulled up nearby, close enough to hear, and Celine was acutely aware of the audience. Riker's jaw worked for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "I want a partner, but I also want my wife alive." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Celine said. "And Riker? This is who I am. Someone who stands her ground when it matters. If you can't accept that, we need to figure it out now." For a long, terrible moment, she thought he might actually argue, might reveal that his promises of equality only went so far, but then his expression shifted into something that might have been resignation or might have been respect. "You're right," he said, "and you're infuriating, and you scared 10 years off my life." He paused. "But you're also right. I can't ask you to be my equal and then demand you stay safe and decorative when things get dangerous." "Thank you," Celine said softly. "But," Riker continued firmly, "next time you ride into potential danger, you at least wait for backup before confronting armed men. That's not about gender, that's about tactical stupidity." Despite everything, Celine felt herself smile. "Fair enough." Behind them, one of the ranch hands, a grizzled man named Pete, who'd been openly skeptical of Celine since her arrival, let out a low whistle. "Boss," he said, "your wife's got more guts than half the men I've ridden with." It wasn't quite acceptance, but it was a start. The Saturday meeting brought every major rancher in the Judith Basin to the Vale Ranch. They arrived throughout the morning, some alone, some with their foremen, all of them curious about what exactly Riker Vale's new wife was proposing. Celine watched them gather from the ranch house window, her stomach tight with nerves she refused to show. "You don't have to do this," Riker said quietly from behind her. "I can present the proposal." "No," Celine said firmly. "If I'm going to have authority here, I need to establish it myself, not hide behind you when things get difficult." Riker moved to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "McKendrick's not here yet." "He'll come," Celine said with more confidence than she felt. "He can't afford not to. If he boycotts a meeting with 8 other ranchers present, he looks like a coward, or like a man who doesn't negotiate. Either way, it weakens his position." Celine turned from the window to face her husband. "Trust me?" "With my life," Riker said simply. "And with my ranch." The words settled something in Celine's chest. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed her practical skirt, and walked out to meet the assembled ranchers. They'd set up the meeting in the largest barn, with chairs arranged in a rough circle and a table at the center where Celine had laid out maps, water charts, and copies of her proposal. The men fell silent as she entered, their eyes following her with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. Thomas Garrett stood near the door, and he gave her a small nod of encouragement. The others simply waited. "Gentlemen," Celine began, and was relieved when her voice came out clear and steady. "Thank you for coming. I know some of you are wondering why Riker's wife is leading this meeting instead of Riker himself. The answer is simple. This proposal is mine, and I believe in standing behind my own work." A few eyebrows rose, but no one interrupted. "We're here because the Judith Basin has a problem," Celine continued. "Water resources are finite, property boundaries are disputed, and without a clear system for resolving conflicts, we're going to see increasing violence as ranches compete for limited resources." She gestured to the maps on the table. "What I'm proposing is a framework, not just for the current dispute with Connor McKendrick, but for how we handle all resource conflicts in this basin moving forward." "You mean you want us to share water?" someone asked skeptically. "I mean, I want us to manage it intelligently," Celine corrected. "Right now, whoever has the most cattle or the most guns gets the water. That's not sustainable. Eventually, someone gets killed, the territorial government steps in, and we all lose our autonomy." She paused. "What I'm suggesting is that we establish clear water rights tied to property ownership, with provisions for temporary sharing during drought years, and binding arbitration for disputes." An older rancher named Sullivan leaned forward. "And who decides what's fair?" "We do," Celine said. "A council made up of representatives from each ranch. Decisions require majority vote, and once made, they're binding on all parties." She met his eyes directly. "It's not perfect, but it's better than the alternative." "The alternative being," Sullivan pressed, "war," Riker said quietly from his position near the door. "Range wars that destroy everyone involved, while lawyers and government officials pick over what's left." Before anyone could respond, the barn door swung open and Connor McKendrick strode in like he owned the place. He was a big man, not tall, but broad and solid with the kind of physical presence that commanded attention. His face was weathered to leather, his eyes pale blue and calculating, and he moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent 15 years as the dominant force in the basin. "Well," he said, his voice carrying easily across the space. "Looks like I'm late to whatever social gathering this is supposed to be." His gaze landed on Celine, and she saw the contempt in it. "Though I have to say, Vale, it's a new low sending your wife to fight your battles." "Mrs. Vale is here because she designed the proposal we're discussing," Thomas Garrett said before Riker could respond. "And because some of us think using our brains instead of our fists might be worth trying." McKendrick's smile was sharp and humorless. "Is that right? Well then, Mrs. Vale, why don't you explain what you think I should do about the fact that your husband's been blocking my access to water my family's used for years?" Celine held his gaze steadily. "Your family never owned that land, Mr. McKendrick. You simply used it because no one was there to stop you. Now someone is. So you're just going to cut me off? Let my herd die of thirst?" "No," Celine said calmly. "I'm proposing we give you legal access to sufficient water for a sustainable herd size. In exchange, you recognize our property boundaries and agree to binding arbitration for future disputes." McKendrick laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You think I'm going to pay you for water that should be free? That I'm going to let some committee tell me how to run my ranch. I think you're going to choose between limited water rights or no water at all, Celine said evenly. Those are your options. Like hell they are. McKendrick's voice dropped to something dangerous. You want to know what I think? I think you and your Boston husband are carpetbaggers trying to push out people who've been here since before Montana was even a territory. And I think the basin would be better off if you packed up and went back east where you belong. Careful, McKendrick, Riker said quietly, and there was steel beneath the soft tone. Or what? McKendrick turned to face him. You going to defend your wife's honor? Please. Everyone here knows this is just her playing at business because you're too soft to tell her to stay in the kitchen where she belongs. The insult hung in the air like smoke. Celine saw Riker's hands clench into fists, saw the fury in his eyes, and knew he was seconds from doing something that would escalate this beyond repair. Mr. McKendrick, she said, and her voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. You can insult me all you want, but it doesn't change the facts. Your herd is too large for your land. Your water sources are depleted because of decades of mismanagement. And you're desperate enough that you sent armed men to threaten a woman rather than negotiate like a civilized person. McKendrick's face flushed dark red. I never... Yesterday afternoon, Celine interrupted, 5 of your men, on my property, making threats. She looked around at the assembled ranchers. Witnesses can confirm it, so before you accuse me of not belonging here, maybe ask yourself what kind of man sends thugs to intimidate his neighbors. The room erupted. Several ranchers started talking at once, their voices overlapping in a chaos of opinion. McKendrick was shouting denials. Garrett was demanding details. And through it all, Celine stood perfectly still at the center of the storm, waiting for the noise to die down. Finally, Sullivan stood and raised his voice above the din. Enough! The room quieted. He looked at McKendrick. Did you send men to the Vale Ranch yesterday? I sent men to check on my cattle, McKendrick said defensively. If Mrs. Vale interpreted that as a threat, 5 armed men, Celine said quietly, on disputed property, making clear statements about how legal ownership doesn't matter. She paused. That wasn't checking on cattle, Mr. McKendrick. That was intimidation. And it failed. McKendrick's jaw clenched so hard Celine could see the muscles jumping. You're making an enemy you can't afford to have. No, Celine said. I'm making it clear that bullying won't work anymore. The basin is changing. Either you change with it or you get left behind. I've been here 15 years. And in 15 years, you've overextended your resources, mismanaged your land, and made yourself dependent on stealing from your neighbors, Celine said flatly. That's not something to be proud of. It's a failure of planning. The words hit like physical blows. McKendrick's face went from red to white, and for a moment Celine thought he might actually strike her. But then Garrett stepped between them, his expression carefully neutral. Connor, he said quietly, why don't you actually look at the proposal before you reject it? I don't need to look at it, McKendrick spat. I'm not going to let some woman tell me how to run my ranch. Then you're a fool, Sullivan said bluntly. The old rancher stood and walked to the table, picking up one of the proposal copies. He scanned it quickly, his eyebrows rising. Connor, this is more generous than you deserve. She's offering you water rights at below market rates, with terms that give you 5 years to adjust your herd size. He looked up. If you had any sense, you'd take it and count yourself lucky. McKendrick snatched the paper from Sullivan's hands and read it with visible skepticism. Celine watched his expression shift as he processed the actual terms, the realization that she wasn't trying to destroy him, just contain him. The fee is too high, he said finally. The fee is calculated based on actual water usage, Celine corrected, and it's a third of what you'd pay if you had to dig new wells or build irrigation systems on your own land. 500 head is too small. 500 head is what your depleted land can actually support sustainably, Celine said. If you want to run a larger herd, improve your own water sources and grazing land. But you don't get to destroy our resources because you refuse to manage your own. McKendrick was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the document. Then he looked up at the other ranchers. And you all support this? I support having a system that prevents range wars, Garrett said carefully. I support clear property rights, Sullivan added, even when they don't favor me personally. One by one, the other ranchers voiced their agreement. Not enthusiastic support necessarily, but a pragmatic recognition that the alternative was worse. McKendrick looked at Celine with undisguised hatred. Fine, I'll accept your damn proposal, but this isn't over, Mrs. Vale. Not by a long shot. The proposal includes binding arbitration, Celine reminded him calmly. If you have grievances, that's how they get resolved, not through threats or violence. We'll see, McKendrick said. Then he turned and walked out of the barn, his footsteps heavy with barely controlled rage. The moment he was gone, the tension in the room eased slightly. Sullivan let out a long breath and looked at Celine with something that might have been respect. That took guts, Mrs. Vale, he said. Stupid guts, maybe, but guts nonetheless. Stupidity would have been letting him establish that intimidation works, Celine replied. This way, everyone knows the rules. Including you, Sullivan said. You just made a powerful enemy. She made 8 powerful allies, Garrett corrected, gesturing to the assembled ranchers, and established that the basin operates on law and agreements instead of whoever has the most guns. He smiled slightly. I'd say that's a fair trade. The meeting continued for another hour, with the ranchers hammering out the details of the water council Celine had proposed. By the end, they had a framework that everyone could live with, not perfect, but workable. And more importantly, they had precedent for how future conflicts would be resolved. When the last rancher finally rode away, Celine allowed herself to collapse into a chair, exhaustion washing over her in waves. Riker sat down beside her, handing her a cup of water. You were magnificent. I was terrified, Celine admitted. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Riker's hand found hers. But you stood up to McKendrick without flinching, you defended yourself against his insults, and you got what you wanted while making him think he won something. That's not just courage, that's political genius. He's going to retaliate, Celine said quietly. You know that, right? Men like McKendrick don't forget humiliation. Let him try, Riker said. We have allies now, documentation, legal backing, and you. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm starting to think there's nothing you can't handle. Celine wanted to believe him, but she'd seen the look in McKendrick's eyes, the cold, calculating hatred of a man who'd been backed into a corner. That kind of rage didn't dissipate. It festered. Still, she'd won today, established herself, proven that she belonged here not as decoration, but as an equal force in basin politics. For now, that would have to be enough. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that was both exhausting and exhilarating. Celine threw herself into learning every aspect of cattle ranching with the same fierce determination she'd applied to saving her family's trading post. She rose before dawn to ride out with the ranch hands, checking fence lines and water sources. She spent hours with Jacob learning about breeding programs, grazing rotation, and winter feed calculations. She reorganized the ranch's financial records, identified cost savings, and implemented inventory systems that made Jacob shake his head in amazement. You've done more in 3 weeks than most ranch wives do in 3 years, he told her one evening. I'm not most ranch wives, Celine replied without looking up from the ledger she was reviewing. No, ma'am, Jacob agreed. You definitely are not. The ranch hands' initial skepticism was slowly transforming into grudging respect. They still didn't quite know what to make of her, a woman who could calculate profit margins and birth survival rates with equal ease, who could ride as hard as any of them, but also negotiate contracts that saved the ranch thousands of dollars. But they were learning that her authority wasn't just courtesy extended because she was the boss's wife. She'd earned it. Danny, the young hand who'd ridden to warn her about McKendrick's men, became something of a shadow. He followed her around asking questions about everything from accounting to animal husbandry, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Why do you want to learn all this? Celine asked him one afternoon. Because, Danny said seriously, I figure if a woman can learn ranching this fast, I got no excuse for staying ignorant. And besides, my ma always said the smartest person in any room was the one asking questions. Celine felt something warm bloom in her chest. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was, Danny said quietly. Died when I was 12. But she taught me to respect people who work hard and think smart, no matter if they're men or women. He ducked his head shyly. You would have liked her, and she would have liked you. It was perhaps the highest compliment anyone at the ranch had given her. But beneath the surface satisfaction of building something real, Celine felt the constant low-grade tension of waiting for McKendrick's retaliation. It came in small ways at first, his cattle somehow ending up on Vale land despite the new agreement, requiring constant vigilance to drive them back. Supplies ordered from merchants in the nearest town arriving late or damaged, with vague explanations that suggested someone had been interfering with deliveries. Word spreading through the basin that the Vale Ranch was struggling, that Riker had made a mistake marrying an inexperienced woman who was running his operation into the ground. All lies, all calculated to undermine them. "He's testing our response," Celine said to Riker one night as they reviewed the latest incident, a shipment of barbed wire that had arrived with half the spools mysteriously missing. "Seeing how much damage he can do through small sabotages before we push back." "So we push back," Riker said grimly. "Document everything. Make formal complaints. Use the same legal framework you established." "Which takes time," Celine pointed out. "And meanwhile, he continues to chip away at our resources and reputation." She stared at the inventory report, her mind working through possibilities. "We need to make him pay a price that hurts more than the satisfaction he's getting from harassing us." "What did you have in mind?" Celine looked up, and Riker saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes that always reminded him why he'd chosen her. "We make him irrelevant." Over the next month, Celine implemented a strategy that was both simple and devastating. Instead of fighting McKendrick directly, she focused on making the Vale Ranch so successful, so well-connected, and so respected that his petty sabotages became meaningless noise. She negotiated contracts with 3 different merchants, ensuring they could never be held hostage by one supplier. She established relationships with ranchers outside the Judith Basin, creating a network of allies who could provide resources if local sources dried up. She organized a cooperative system where smaller ranches could pool resources for bulk purchasing, saving everyone money while building loyalty. And most brilliantly, she started writing articles for the territorial newspaper about modern ranching techniques: water conservation, sustainable grazing, financial management. The articles were practical, well-written, and made her a recognizable voice in Montana Territory ranching circles. Within 2 months, people weren't talking about the Vale Ranch as that place where Riker married some woman. They were talking about it as that innovative operation run by Riker and Celine Vale. McKendrick's reaction was predictable. He escalated. It happened on a cold October evening when Celine was riding back from checking the South Range. She'd stayed out later than intended, and dusk was falling fast across the valley. She was maybe 2 miles from the ranch house when she heard horses approaching from behind. She turned in her saddle to see 3 riders closing in fast. Men she didn't recognize, their faces shadowed by hat brims pulled low. Every instinct screamed danger. Celine kicked Tempest into a gallop, leaning low over the mare's neck as they raced toward home. The men gave chase, their horses pounding behind her. She could hear them gaining, could feel Tempest straining beneath her, and knew with cold certainty that she wasn't going to make it. Then she heard gunfire. Not aimed at her, aimed over the heads of her pursuers. She risked a glance back and saw Danny and 2 other ranch hands charging toward the chase, rifles raised. The 3 strangers immediately veered off, disappearing into the gathering darkness rather than risk confrontation. Celine pulled Tempest to a halt, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Danny rode up beside her, his young face white with fear and anger. "Are you hurt, Mrs. Vale?" "No," Celine managed. "Just scared." "We've been watching the approaches since sundown," Danny explained. "Jacob figured McKendrick might try something after you embarrassed him in that newspaper article about water mismanagement." Celine had indeed written an article, not naming McKendrick directly, but describing in detail how poor grazing practices and overextended herds led to depleted water sources. Everyone in the basin knew who she was talking about. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You probably saved my life." Danny's jaw set in a hard line that made him look older than his 17 years. "This can't continue, ma'am. McKendrick's not going to stop with harassment. He's escalating to violence." "I know," Celine said, and she did. The question was what to do about it. That night, the ranch house felt different. The men who'd previously been skeptical of Celine now looked at her with protective concern. Jacob insisted on posting guards around the clock. Riker barely spoke, his fury a palpable force that made the air feel heavy. "We're going to the territorial marshal," he said finally, filing formal charges. "McKendrick just crossed a line he can't uncross." "With what proof?" Celine asked quietly. "3 unidentified riders who never actually harmed me." McKendrick will claim he knows nothing about it, and we can't prove otherwise. So we just let him try to kill you? No, Celine said. We make him face consequences that actually matter to him. She spent the next 3 days working on something she'd been planning since the first signs of McKendrick's sabotage. When she was finished, she had a document that would either end the conflict or escalate it beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. She called it a comprehensive analysis of range management in the Judith Basin, a case study in sustainable versus exploitative practices. The document was 20 pages of meticulously researched, carefully documented evidence showing exactly how McKendrick's ranching practices were destroying not just his own land, but threatening the entire basin's water table. She included water surveys, grazing studies, expert testimony from university agricultural professors she'd corresponded with, and financial projections showing that his operation was unsustainable. Then she had it published in 3 different territorial newspapers and sent copies to the Montana Agricultural Board, the Territorial Land Management Office, and every major rancher in the region. The response was immediate and catastrophic for McKendrick. The Agricultural Board launched an investigation. Other ranchers who'd been quietly suffering from McKendrick's overgrazing suddenly had documentation to support their complaints. Banks reviewing his credit application saw the financial analysis and tightened his access to loans. Within a week, McKendrick's operation was under scrutiny from every official body in Montana Territory. He showed up at the Vale Ranch on a Saturday morning, his face purple with rage, a copy of Celine's report clutched in his hand. "You've destroyed me," he said, his voice shaking. "You've systematically destroyed everything I've built." Celine stood on the porch with Riker beside her and half the ranch hands watching from strategic positions. "No, Mr. McKendrick, you destroyed yourself through years of mismanagement and exploitation. I just documented it." "This is slander, lies." "It's peer-reviewed research using publicly available data," Celine corrected calmly. "Every claim is sourced. Every conclusion is supported by evidence. If you believe it's inaccurate, you're welcome to present contradicting documentation to the Agricultural Board." McKendrick's hands clenched into fists. "You think you're so smart, so much better than everyone else, but you're just a woman playing at business, and sooner or later reality is going to remind you of your place." "My place," Celine said quietly, "is wherever I choose to stand. And right now, I'm standing on my property, with legal documentation supporting every action I've taken, surrounded by people who respect competence over gender." She paused. "Where are you standing, Mr. McKendrick?" The question hung in the air. McKendrick looked around at the Vale Ranch, the well-maintained buildings, the healthy cattle, the organized efficiency of an operation built on intelligence rather than brute force. Then he looked back at Celine, and something in his expression shifted. Not surrender. Not quite. But a kind of exhausted recognition. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want you to stop trying to destroy us," Celine said. "I want you to honor the water agreement, and I want you to understand that the frontier is changing. Men who refuse to change with it don't survive." "And if I do all that, then I'll help you," Celine said, and saw shock register on his face. "Not out of charity, but because a basin full of failing ranches helps no one. I'll share the sustainable practices we're implementing, connect you with the agricultural experts I've been working with, give you a chance to rebuild your operation into something that can actually last." McKendrick stared at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. "Why would you help me after everything I've done?" "Because," Celine said, "I'd rather have a neighbor who succeeds through hard work than an enemy who fails and takes everyone down with them." She stepped forward. "You have a choice, Mr. McKendrick. You can keep fighting a war you've already lost, or you can accept that the rules have changed and adapt. What's it going to be?" For a long moment, McKendrick didn't move. Then slowly, he nodded. "I'll honor the water agreement." "And the harassment stops," Celine pressed. "And the harassment stops," McKendrick agreed. He looked at her with something that might have been grudging respect. "You're a hard woman, Mrs. Vale." "I'm a fair woman," Celine corrected. "There's a difference." McKendrick rode away without another word, his shoulders slightly bowed. Celine watched him go and felt something release in her chest. Not quite triumph, but a kind of tired satisfaction. "That was a risk," Riker said quietly, "offering to help him." "It was strategic," Celine replied. A defeated enemy might destroy himself and damage the basin in the process. A rebuilt neighbor contributes to everyone's prosperity. She looked at her husband. Besides, I meant it. I'd rather build something sustainable than just win battles. Riker pulled her into his arms, and she let herself lean into his strength for a moment. You know, he said, when I first saw you in that courtyard, I knew you were strong, but I had no idea just how strong. Strong enough? Celine asked, a hint of vulnerability creeping into her voice. Strong enough to change an entire territory, Riker said. Strong enough to build an empire. Strong enough to be exactly who you were always meant to be. That night, as Celine lay in bed listening to the sounds of the ranch, settling for sleep, she thought about how far she'd come. 3 months ago, she'd been the invisible daughter, working herself to exhaustion for a family that barely acknowledged her existence. Now she was building something real, a partnership, a business, a life that actually belonged to her. It wasn't easy, it wasn't safe, but it was hers. And that made every challenge, every risk, every terrifying moment worth it. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance. That same lonely, free sound that had haunted her since the first night she'd stood beside Riker on the porch. But now, when she heard it, Celine didn't think of loneliness. She thought of survival, of strength, of refusing to be tamed by a world that wanted women silent and small. She thought of the empire she was building, one difficult decision at a time. And she smiled in the darkness, knowing that the hardest part, the part where she'd had to prove she deserved to be here, was finally, truly over. Now came the part where she showed them all what she could actually accomplish. Winter came to the Judith Basin with the relentless certainty of a debt coming due. The first snow arrived in mid-November, transforming the valley into something both beautiful and merciless. Celine had survived Montana winters before, but experiencing one while running a cattle operation was different. The constant vigilance required to keep animals alive, the endless calculations of feed supplies versus storm duration, the knowledge that one mistake could cost hundreds of lives and thousands of dollars. She threw herself into the work with the same fierce determination that had defined every other challenge she'd faced. By December, the ranch hands had stopped making distinctions between the boss and Mrs. Vale when discussing who gave orders. She was simply part of the leadership, her authority as natural as Riker's. The letter from Charlotte arrived on a bitter cold Tuesday in late December. Celine recognized her sister's handwriting on the envelope and felt her heart clench with an emotion she couldn't quite name, part hope, part fear, part longing for a connection she'd thought was severed forever. She waited until evening to open it, sitting beside the fire in the ranch house parlor while Riker worked on breeding records at his desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. "Dearest Celine," the letter began, and Charlotte's voice seemed to echo from the page. "I hope this letter finds you well and happy in your new life. I've wanted to write for months but kept losing my courage, afraid you wouldn't want to hear from the family that treated you so poorly. But recent events have compelled me to set aside my fear and reach out." Celine's eyes skimmed ahead, her breath catching. "Mother is very ill. The doctors say it's consumption, though I suspect she's been sick for far longer than she admitted. She's been asking for you, not constantly, and never when she thinks I can hear, but I've caught her several times staring at your empty chair and whispering your name. I don't know if she wants to apologize or simply see you one last time, but Celine, I think she's dying, and I think she knows it." The words blurred slightly, and Celine realized she was crying. She wiped her eyes impatiently and continued reading. "As for the trading post, I have remarkable news. The freight network I built with Baptiste and the other small operators is thriving. We've not only broken the Carter monopoly, but established routes that are more efficient and less expensive than anything they offered. The Commerce Board's ruling against Jonathan Carter opened doors I never imagined possible. Several other merchants have approached me about expanding the network to other territories." Despite her tears, Celine felt pride bloom in her chest. Charlotte had found her strength after all. "I'm still learning, still making mistakes, but Celine, I'm actually good at this. The negotiations, the logistics, the strategic planning, it turns out I have skills I never knew existed because I never had the chance to use them. You gave me that chance. By leaving, by refusing to keep carrying everything yourself, you forced me to become someone capable. I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful for that gift, even though I know how much it cost you." The letter continued with business details, updates on people Celine had known, small observations about how the valley had changed. But it was the final paragraph that made Selena's decision. I know I have no right to ask anything of you after how we treated you, but if you have any love left for Mother, or for me, please consider coming home, even if just for a visit, even if just to say goodbye. I promise you won't be walking back into the cage you escaped. Things are different now. I'm different now. And I think you'd be surprised by what we've built in your absence. Your loving sister, Charlotte. Celine sat holding the letter for a long time, staring into the fire. Riker eventually noticed her silence and looked up from his work. Bad news? My mother's dying, Celine said quietly. Charlotte wants me to come home. Riker set down his pen and crossed the room to sit beside her. Do you want to go? I don't know, Celine admitted. Part of me thinks she doesn't deserve my presence, that she spent my entire life making me feel worthless, and I don't owe her comfort in her final days. She paused. But another part of me remembers that she gave me her mother's ring, that she told me I could come back if I needed to, that maybe, in her own damaged way, she did love me. Those things can both be true, Riker said gently. She can have failed you terribly and still deserve the chance to make peace before she dies. And if I go and she uses the opportunity to hurt me one last time, then you'll survive it, Riker said, just like you've survived everything else. He took her hand. But Celine, if you don't go and spend the rest of your life wondering if you should have, that's a different kind of wound. Celine leaned her head against his shoulder. I'd need to leave soon, before the storms get worse. Then we leave soon, Riker said simply. We? You think I'm letting you face your family alone? Riker's voice carried a note of humor. I'm your husband, your partner. Where you go, I go. The ranch will survive under Jacob's management for a few weeks, Riker finished. He's been running it longer than I have, and he's more than capable. He tilted her face up to look at him. Your family needs you, and even if you don't think you need them, you deserve the chance to find out. They left 3 days later as soon as the weather cleared enough to make travel feasible. The journey back felt both endless and too short, each mile bringing Celine closer to a confrontation she wasn't sure she was ready for. They arrived at the Mercer trading post on a gray afternoon in early January. The place looked smaller than Celine remembered, or perhaps she'd simply grown larger. The buildings were the same, the layout unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted, or perhaps the shift was in her. Charlotte must have been watching for them, because she came running out of the main house before they'd even dismounted. She looked different, thinner, more serious, with an edge of competence that hadn't been there before. But when she threw her arms around Celine, she felt exactly the same. You came, Charlotte whispered. I was so afraid you wouldn't come. How could I not? Celine pulled back to look at her sister. How is she? Charlotte's expression darkened. Worse. The doctor says it's a matter of weeks now, maybe days. She's been asking for you constantly since I sent the letter. They walked into the house together, Riker following at a respectful distance. The interior was both familiar and strange. The same furniture, the same layout, but somehow more worn. Or perhaps Celine was simply seeing it more clearly. Constance's room was on the second floor, and Charlotte paused outside the door. She's very weak, and she says things sometimes that don't make sense, the fever, the doctor says. I understand, Celine said quietly. She pushed open the door and stepped into the dim room. Constance lay in the bed, looking impossibly small beneath the quilts. The woman who'd once commanded every space she entered had been reduced to a fragile collection of bones and shallow breathing. But her eyes were still sharp when they landed on Celine. You came, Constance said, and her voice was a shadow of its former authority. I didn't think you would. Charlotte said you were asking for me, Celine replied, moving closer to the bed. I wanted... Constance paused, struggling for breath. I wanted to see if you'd survived, if that man kept his promises, if you were happy. Celine sat in the chair beside the bed, studying her mother's face. I'm more than happy. I'm building something real, something that matters. Good. Constance closed her eyes briefly. That's good. When she opened them again, they were wet with tears. I was cruel to you. Your entire life I was cruel. The admission hung in the air between them. Celine had imagined this moment 1,000 times, the apology she'd never thought she'd receive. But now that it was happening, she found she didn't know what to say. "You were scared," she said finally. "Scared of losing everything after Father died. Scared that I couldn't be what you needed me to be." "No." Constance's hand emerged from beneath the quilts, reaching for Celine's. "I was scared that you were exactly what you are. Strong enough to survive without needing anyone. Strong enough to make me look weak by comparison." Her fingers trembled against Celine's palm. "Your father saw it. He knew you were special. And I hated you for it because it reminded me of everything I could never be." The words landed like stones, heavy and painful and somehow freeing. Celine felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "I needed you to see me," she whispered. "Just once. I needed you to look at me and see something worth valuing." "I see you now," Constance said. "And Celine, you're magnificent. Everything I should have been and wasn't. Everything Charlotte is becoming because you showed her it was possible." Her voice broke. "I'm so sorry I wasted your entire life before realizing it." Celine gripped her mother's hand tighter. "You didn't waste it. You made me strong enough to survive when I had to. That's worth something." "Is it enough?" Constance's eyes searched her face. "Can you forgive me?" The question was enormous and complicated and impossible to answer simply. Could she forgive years of neglect? Years of being made to feel invisible? Years of watching her sister receive the love and attention she desperately wanted? But looking at her mother's dying face, Celine realized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about refusing to let the past poison the future. "Yes," she said quietly. "I forgive you." Constance's face crumpled, and she wept with the kind of raw, broken sobs that came from a lifetime of repressed emotion. Celine held her mother's hand and let her cry, offering the comfort she'd never received herself. When the tears finally subsided, Constance seemed more peaceful. "Tell me about your life," she said. "The ranch, your husband, everything." So Celine did. She talked about the Judith Basin and the water rights negotiation and standing up to Connor McKendrick. She talked about learning to manage cattle and implementing new financial systems and writing articles that were changing how people thought about ranching. She talked about being seen as an equal rather than just useful. Constance listened with her eyes closed, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. When Celine finished, her mother's voice was barely a whisper. "You found it. What I spent my whole life searching for and never found." "What's that?" "A place where being strong wasn't a liability," Constance said. "Where being smart and capable and fierce made you powerful instead of threatening." She opened her eyes one last time. "I'm glad one of us made it out of the cage." Those were the last coherent words Constance Mercer spoke. She slipped into unconsciousness that night and never woke. She died 3 days later with both her daughters at her bedside, finally at peace. The funeral was small and simple. The few remaining neighbors came to pay respects, but the Trading Post community had shrunk over the years. As they lowered Constance's coffin into the frozen ground, Celine felt a complicated mixture of grief and relief, and something that might have been closure. Charlotte stood beside her, and when it was over, she took Celine's arm. "Walk with me." They walked through the Trading Post grounds, and Charlotte showed Celine everything that had changed. The warehouse had been reorganized with new inventory systems. The office had been expanded to accommodate the freight network's administrative needs, and the small room that had once been Celine's converted closet was now a proper bedroom, Charlotte's room, she explained, because she'd moved out of the larger space. "Why?" Celine asked. Charlotte smiled. "Because I didn't need a beautiful room to feel valuable anymore. I needed to earn my own worth. And smaller quarters reminded me that I was building something through work, not waiting for someone to give it to me." They ended up in the office, surrounded by ledgers and shipping manifests and all the evidence of Charlotte's growing empire. Celine looked through the records with professional interest, impressed by the organization and strategic thinking evident in every decision. "You've done extraordinary work," she said honestly. "I learned from the best," Charlotte replied. Then she took a deep breath. "Celine, I have a proposition for you." "Oh?" "The freight network is expanding beyond Montana territory. We have opportunities in Wyoming, Idaho, even Dakota territory, but I'm stretched too thin managing everything myself." Charlotte pulled out a document and handed it to Celine. I want you to be my partner, not just in name, but in actual authority. You'd handle the strategic planning and financial management while I manage operations. We'd share profits equally and make all major decisions together. Celine stared at the partnership agreement, her mind racing. It was a generous offer, more than generous. It was recognition of her abilities and an opportunity to build something significant. But it wasn't what she wanted. Charlotte, she said gently, this is amazing, and I'm honored. But my life is in the Judith Basin now. The ranch, the work we're doing there, that's where I belong. Charlotte's face fell slightly, but then she nodded. I understand. I had to ask, though, because you should know that you're wanted here, that this place, this business, exists because of the foundation you built. Which is exactly why you don't need me anymore, Celine said. You're capable of extraordinary things on your own. Don't make the mistake of thinking you need someone else to validate that. Charlotte laughed, and it sounded almost like crying. When did you get so wise? When I finally had the space to figure out who I actually was, Celine replied. They spent the next week together, and it was perhaps the best time the sisters had ever shared. They talked about everything, their childhood, their mother's complicated legacy, their hopes for the future. Charlotte confessed that she'd been courting Baptiste, the French-Canadian trapper who'd helped establish the freight network. He's kind and intelligent, and he sees me as more than just decorative, Charlotte said, blushing slightly. And he makes me laugh. Is that enough to build a life on? It's a start, Celine said. The rest you build together, day by day. Like you and Riker? Like me and Riker, Celine confirmed. On their last night before leaving, Charlotte gave Celine a small wooden box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Celine in their mother's handwriting but never sent. I found them in her desk after she died, Charlotte explained. She'd been writing to you for months, practicing what she wanted to say, I think. Or maybe just trying to understand her own feelings. She paused. I thought you should have them, even if you never read them. Celine opened one at random. The handwriting was shaky, the words difficult to make out, but the message was clear. My dearest Celine, I dream about you constantly. Wonder if you're warm enough, if you're eating properly, if that man treats you as well as he promised. I tell myself I don't care, but the truth is I care more than I ever showed when you were here. Forgive me. Please forgive me. Celine closed the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. Thank you for this. Thank you for coming home, Charlotte said, for giving Mother the chance to make peace, for showing me that strength and love aren't mutually exclusive. She hugged her sister tightly. And Celine, if you ever need anything, anything at all, you write to me, because you were right. We're not competitors anymore. We're partners in survival. The journey back to the Judith Basin felt different than the journey out. Celine carried her mother's letters in her saddlebag and her sister's love in her heart, and she felt lighter than she had in months. Are you all right? Riker asked as they rode through the winter landscape. I'm more than all right, Celine said. I'm free, really free, for the first time in my life. How so? Because I don't have to prove anything anymore, Celine explained. Not to my mother, not to my sister, not even to myself. I know who I am, I know what I'm capable of, and I know that I deserve to be exactly where I am. Riker reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. You've always deserved it. The rest of us were just catching up. They arrived back at the ranch on a brilliant February afternoon, when the snow was starting to melt and the first hints of spring were beginning to show in the valley. Jacob and the ranch hands were waiting in the courtyard, and Celine was surprised to see how genuinely happy they looked to see her return. Welcome back, Mrs. Vale, Jacob said, and there was real warmth in his voice. Place hasn't been the same without you. Problems? Celine asked, already mentally cataloging what might have gone wrong in their absence. Nothing we couldn't handle, Jacob assured her, but the men wanted you to know that you were missed, not just as the boss's wife, as our boss. Danny stepped forward, holding something wrapped in oilcloth. We made you something. Well, Pete made it, but we all helped design it. He handed her the package, and Celine unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a sign, beautifully carved from solid oak, with words burned into the wood in careful letters. Vale Ranch, established 1878, Riker and Celine Vale, proprietors. Celine felt her throat tighten with emotion. This is beautiful. We figured it was time people knew that this place belongs to both of you, Pete said gruffly. Not just him, both of you equally. They mounted the sign above the main gate that afternoon, and Celine stood looking at it for a long time. Her name, her ranch, her life. Built with her own hands and her own mind and her own fierce refusal to be anything less than she was capable of being. That spring brought changes to the entire Judith Basin. The water council Celine had established became the model for resource management across Montana Territory. Her articles on sustainable ranching were collected and published as a handbook that agricultural colleges began using as a textbook. And the Vail Ranch became known not just for its success, but for its innovation and fair dealing. Connor McKendrick, true to his word, honored the water agreement and began implementing the sustainable practices Celine had shared with him. It wasn't a friendship, they would never be friends, but it was a functional partnership based on mutual respect and clear boundaries. Thomas Garrett and his wife became regular dinner guests at the Vail Ranch, and their daughter began corresponding with Celine about ranching techniques, hoping to follow in her footsteps. Sullivan, the old rancher who'd been skeptical at first, started sending other young women to Celine for mentorship, saying that if his granddaughters were going to inherit his ranch, they needed to learn from someone who understood both ranching and what it meant to be a woman in a man's world. By summer, Celine had quietly assembled a network of women across Montana Territory who were learning to run ranches, manage businesses, and claim authority in spaces that had previously excluded them. She didn't advertise this network or make grand pronouncements about it. She simply answered letters, shared knowledge, and provided support to women who reminded her of herself. Strong, capable, and tired of being invisible. In July, a letter arrived from the territorial governor's office. Celine opened it with curiosity and read it twice before she believed what it said. "Riker," she called, and her voice shook slightly. "You need to see this." He came to stand beside her, reading over her shoulder. The letter was an appointment, asking Celine to serve on the newly formed Montana Territorial Agricultural Advisory Board. The position would involve traveling to various ranches and farms, providing expertise on sustainable practices, and helping to shape territorial policy on land management. "They want me to help write the laws," Celine said, still stunned. "Me? A woman who couldn't even vote? They want the person who revolutionized basin resource management and published the most comprehensive ranching handbook in the territory," Riker corrected. "The fact that you're a woman is just proof that they're finally getting smart about recognizing competence." "If I accept, I'd be away from the ranch frequently," Celine said slowly, "traveling, attending meetings, working with government officials." "Which I can handle," Riker said, "or more accurately, which we can handle together by reorganizing our responsibilities." He pulled her close. "Celine, you were never meant to stay in one place. You were meant to change things. This is just the next step." She accepted the appointment the next day, and over the following years she used that platform to transform how Montana Territory approached land management, water rights, and agricultural sustainability. But the work she was most proud of happened quietly, in the letters she exchanged with women across the frontier. Women who wrote to tell her they'd stood up to corrupt suppliers, or negotiated their own business contracts, or insisted on being treated as partners rather than property. Women who'd found the courage to claim their own strength because Celine had shown them it was possible. 3 years after arriving at the Vail Ranch, Celine stood on the porch one autumn evening watching the sun set over the valley. The ranch had doubled in size. The herd was healthy and growing. The operation ran with the kind of efficiency that came from years of careful planning and hard work. But more than that, it was hers. Really hers. Not in the sense of legal ownership, though her name was on the deed beside Riker's, but in the deeper sense of having built something with her own mind and hands and determination. Riker came to stand beside her, handing her a cup of coffee. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the mountains darken against the sunset. "Do you ever regret it?" Riker asked finally. "Leaving your family, the trading post? Everything you knew?" Celine considered this question carefully. She thought about her mother, finally at peace, about Charlotte, thriving in her own right, about the lonely woman she'd been in that courtyard 3 years ago, rebuilding wagon wheels and believing she existed only to work in silence. "No," she said. "Every hard thing that happened brought me here, made me who I am, taught me what I'm capable of." She looked at Riker, and her voice was soft but certain. The frontier tried to bury me beneath hardship and invisibility, and the expectation that I should be grateful for scraps. Instead, it forged me into someone who could build an empire. Our empire, Riker corrected gently. Our empire, Selena agreed. Built on partnership and equality and the radical idea that a woman's strength is worth celebrating instead of hiding. She leaned against him, and they watched the last light fade from the sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were always new challenges. Negotiations to handle, decisions to make, systems to improve. But tonight, standing on the porch of the home she'd built with her own vision and determination, Celine Mercer Vale was exactly where she was meant to be. The woman no one had seen had become impossible to ignore. And the invisible daughter had transformed into a legend whose impact would echo through Montana territory for generations to come. Not because she'd been beautiful or delicate or easy, but because she'd been brave enough to claim her own strength and build something worth remembering. The frontier had tested her with every weapon it possessed: poverty, prejudice, violence, isolation, and the crushing weight of others' expectations. And she had survived it all, not by becoming smaller or quieter or more acceptable, but by becoming more fully herself. As the stars began to emerge overhead, brilliant and infinite and free, Celine smiled. The journey that had started in a frozen courtyard with a stranger's arrival had led her here, to a life that was hard and beautiful and entirely her own. And that, she thought, was worth everything it had cost.